A strange rumble lingers beneath London's pavements tonight, a low tremor that isn't from traffic or trains, but from something older. Echoes of wooden stakes, vanished shorelines, and human footprints found deep in the mud of the Thames that predate every recorded story about the city. Archaeologists uncovered them in layers of silt, where the river had quietly guarded its secrets. And these prints belong to people who walked here thousands of years, before London had a name, before roads carved through the landscape, before any kingdom claimed this winding stretch of water. It's a reminder that beneath the glowing glass towers and restless commuter rhythms, there is a hidden chronology running far deeper than most imagine, and that London's first chapter reads more like an intimate riverside survival tale than the beginnings of a global metropolis. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you listen, tell me, where are you from and what time is it there right now? The river was different in those early days, broad and tidal, rising and falling with a rhythm that shaped daily existence. Families settled on its banks because it offered water fish, reeds for weaving, and a surface that could be crossed or trapped, depending on the season. When the tide went out, the mudflats revealed tracks of deer and aurochs, and early hunters watched patiently from stands of alder and willow, their fires sending up thin columns of white smoke that drifted across a quietly breathing landscape. You can almost imagine the cool mist of the river at dawn, curling around skin, carrying the smell of wet earth and damp wood, the soft crunch of flint under bare feet, as tools were shaped with slow, practiced movements. The first Londoners lived lightly on this land, but they left clues, flint blades, antler picks, charred hazelnuts, and post holes from structures that may have been simple dwellings or temporary storage shelters. Some pits hold animal bones arranged in ways that suggest ritual or seasonal feasting gestures from people who didn't see the world as a separate thing to conquer, but as a living companion. The long arc of the Thames Valley held them in a gentle cradle, offering resources, yet shifting constantly, sometimes flooding, sometimes retreating, always temperamental. As the centuries drifted by, communities adapted to climate changes, rising waters, and new patterns in animal migration. A quieter possibility lingers, whether these early groups passed stories along the banks, memories carried through spoken tradition, linking generations through whispered explanations of why the river rose in certain moons, or why certain bends in the water felt avoided at dusk. Archaeology gives us objects. Imagination fills the silence between them with a sense of human presence moving through fog and forest shade. By the late Mesolithic and early Neolithic periods, more permanent structures began to appear. Wooden platforms and causeways stretched into marshland, suggesting not just practicality, but intention. One particularly intriguing site reveals a series of timbers, arranged with careful precision, as if marking a route across unstable ground, or perhaps delineating a sacred approach to the water. Their alignment raises questions about ritual navigation and communal organization, showing us the first hints of a shared identity forming along these banks. London, long before it was London, was already a place that invited settlement creativity and cooperation. With the arrival of farming, the landscape changed again. Clearings appeared where forest once dominated fields rippled with early cereal crops, and domesticated animals grazed where wild herds had once thundered. The Thames provided fertile soil, but it also demanded respect. There are signs of deliberate offerings, pottery shards, tools, and even entire weapon sets placed into the river, as if people were expressing gratitude or seeking protection. Whether these were symbolic acts tied to seasonal cycles or markers of community status, they imply a deep relationship with the waterway. Paths emerged along ridges and river edges, slowly becoming well-worn routes linking clusters of families. These early tracks would one day evolve into Roman roads, medieval lanes, and eventually London's great thoroughfares. But in these earliest centuries, the routes were soft and muddy, shaped by the simplest logic. Follow the river, keep close to its resources, respect its boundaries. Even now, London's geography whispers the same advice. The city bends and swells in response to the Thames, just as those early settlements did. Somewhere in this quiet prehistory, the seeds of urban life were planted. This wasn't a city, yet nowhere close. But the patterns of human movement show a magnetic pull toward this valley. People kept returning, building, abandoning, and rebuilding. The constant motion created layers, cultural, ecological, and emotional, that would later make London feel like a place with depth, memory, and weight. A persistent puzzle rests in how these early groups managed environmental challenges. Rising sea levels after the last ice age reshaped the estuary, dramatically pushing saltwater miles upriver at times. Did communities retreat inland? Did they adapt with new construction methods or seasonal migrations? The archaeological record hints at resilience rather than retreat. Every time the river changed, people found a new equilibrium, crafting tools better suited to wetland environments or repositioning settlements on higher ground. Their resourcefulness forms a quiet foundational chapter to London's much later reputation as a city that bends but never breaks. By the end of the Neolithic period, long before Rome cast its imperial gaze toward Britannia, the London basin was dotted with burial sites, pathways, farming enclosures, and timber structures that suggest a complex social landscape. Nothing here resembles the dense urban sprawl we know, yet the essentials were already in motion. People gathering, exchanging, adapting, and weaving their lives along a river that shaped everything. The Thames wasn't merely a backdrop. It was the spine of the early community, the feature around which identity formed. When the Roman ships first appeared on the Thames, the river's banks must have looked wild and stubborn dense, with reeds trembling with the calls of waterfowl, and scattered with villages that had no idea they were about to become part of something vast and organized. The Romans, masters of geometry and patience, saw opportunity in the mud. They didn't care about the legends whispered by local tribes or the slow pulse of tidal water. They cared about control. And so, around AD 47, they founded Londinium, a name whose echo has never faded. It began as a bridgehead, practical, temporary, but soon transformed into a planned rectangular city, designed with military precision, a little patch of Rome transplanted onto the edge of empire. To imagine the first Roman streets here is to picture a world of order imposed on chaos. Wooden jetties crept into the river, warehouses rose from the shoreline, and traders arrived with amphorae of olive oil, fine wine, salt fish, and ceramics marked with Latin stamps. The smell of bitumen and wet timber mingled with the sweet tang of imported spices. Soldiers in segmented armor moved between watchtowers, and builders pounded nails into frames for a bridge that would become the lifeline of this new outpost. It wasn't beauty they sought, it was permanence, and that required infrastructure. Roman engineers, ever pragmatic, chose the North Bank as their base, raising a fort near what would one day be called the City of London. Within decades, Londinium grew into a bustling hub, roughly 30,000 souls, packed behind walls of wood and later stone. It had forums for debate baths, for cleansing temples for worship, and drains that carried away the waste of its ambitions. The city even minted its own coins, a declaration that commerce and civilization had arrived. Beneath it all, the Thames kept flowing, bearing ships upriver from Gaul and Hispania, bringing new faces, accents, and diseases along with wealth. But the Roman dream in Britain was never uncontested. Around AD 60, when the Iceni queen Boudica led her rebellion, Londinium was among her prime targets. Contemporary accounts describe how her forces descended upon the city like a storm. Civilians fled, soldiers retreated, and flames consumed the timbered streets. The charred archaeological layer, still visible beneath modern buildings, known as the Boudiccan destruction horizon, marks that day when the city was wiped off the map. Yet the Romans returned almost immediately. For them, rebuilding was a statement of defiance. They replanned the streets, wider, added stone defenses, and reinforced the bridge. The empire had learned its lesson. Permanence demanded not only engineering, but resilience. As the decades passed, Londinium's skyline shifted upward. Stone replaced timber-tiled roofs, replaced thatch, and forums buzzed with merchants shouting over one another in a mix of Latin Brythonic and borrowed tongues. Mosaic floors gleamed under lamplight, and the smell of roasted meat and incense drifted through bathhouses. Here, officials recorded taxes, legions mustered supplies, and clerks archived the machinery of empire. To live in Roman London was to exist at the edge of sophistication and uncertainty. Civilization one day, wild frontier the next. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of that layered life. A child's leather shoe, glass beads, curses scratched onto lead tablets, tossed into the river, asking deities to punish thieves. Beneath Cannon Street, they found remnants of the Roman bridge. Under Leadenhall Market, traces of a grand basilica where justice and trade intertwined. The Romans left order in stone, but their stories now lie beneath feet that no longer notice them. Every time construction workers hit something ancient, the modern city briefly remembers that its ground is not entirely its own. For nearly 4 centuries, Londinium endured plagues, fires, and the slow retreat of imperial power. Inscriptions tell us of officials worried about supply lines, about taxes owed to Rome, even as imperial attention shifted eastward. By the 4th century, the city's walls, massive 15 feet thick, in places became both a shield and a symbol of isolation. Inside them, fewer residents remained. The grand temples and bathhouses fell into disused roofs, collapsed, and weeds crawled across mosaic floors. Outside, Saxon settlers began to appear in the surrounding countryside, bringing with them new gods, new tongues, and new uncertainties. One haunting archaeological discovery gives us a snapshot of those uneasy years, a cemetery where graves mix Roman burial customs with Germanic-style grave goods, glass cups beside brooches, coins near handmade beads. It tells of cultural fusion of people who weren't strictly Roman or Saxon, but something in between. Londinium, even in decline, remained a place where identities blended. The empire had given structure, but the people who lived here kept rewriting what that meant. When the Roman legions finally withdrew around AD 410, the city did not die in an instant. It simply faded from focus like an abandoned stage after the audience has left. Some inhabitants clung on, others drifted to the safer uplands or the more fertile east. The bridges rotted, the sewers clogged, and the once thriving port turned silent, except for gulls and fishermen. The walls still stood stubborn skeletal outlines against a sky that no longer smelled of Roman smoke. For perhaps 2 centuries, the heart of the city slumbered. Wildflowers crept through streets where senators once walked, and yet in that silence, something enduring lingered, the knowledge that this location, this bend in the river, was too valuable to stay empty forever. Debate what happened to those who stayed behind. Did they maintain some fragment of Roman customs, or did they blend seamlessly into the waves of newcomers who arrived later? A handful of coins and pottery shards suggest limited continuity. A market perhaps, or small communities, trading by the old wharves. If so, they lived among ruins, their huts built against ancient walls, children playing where legions had drilled. For them, history wasn't a distant story. It was the landscape itself, crumbling yet familiar. When the legions were gone and the empire's light flickered out over Britain, the Thames rolled on its tides, marking the slow heartbeat of a forgotten city. The Romans had left walls and streets, but they also left emptiness, a ghost grid of stone where grass grew through the cracks. Into this quiet ruin came new sounds, the creak of ox carts, the murmur of strange accents, the ring of iron tools that did not belong to Rome. These were the Saxons, part settlers, part opportunists, drawn by the fertile valleys and open land. For them, the old city Londinium was a shell haunted by decay and memories that had no place in their simpler earthbound worldview. So rather than revive it, they built something new beside it, Londenwich. Londenwick, roughly 2 miles to the west of the Roman ruins, grew gradually along the river's curve, closer to what we now call the Strand and Covent Garden. It was not a fortified city, but a market town, open, noisy, and thriving on trade. Ships from across the North Sea brought furs, amber wine, and glass beads. Farmers from inland carried grain and livestock to sell by the river. The Thames, again, became a thread of life, pulling people together from scattered kingdoms and distant coasts. And though there were no grand forums or mosaics anymore, there was a different kind of energy here, raw, flexible, and human. Imagine it: narrow lanes of timber huts, thatched roofs dripping after rain, smoke curling up through the damp air, and the rhythmic clatter of craftsmen shaping metal and leather. The sound of the hammer replaced the echo of Roman marble. Markets spilled into the streets. The smell of fish mingled with ale and sweat. It was rough, sometimes lawless, but alive. A visitor walking through Londenwick might have heard fragments of Latin mixed with Old English and Norse words, a linguistic stew forming the earliest DNA of modern London speech. This period, the 7th to 9th centuries, was one of constant flux. Power shifted between emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, and each sought to control this crucial trading hub. Religion, too, changed shape. The old pagan shrines along the river gave way to new wooden churches, their bells faintly echoing over the water. Missionaries arrived carrying relics, and Roman books planting crosses where once there had been runes. The re-Christianization of London marked a kind of reconnection with the continent, not politically, but spiritually. In that sense, the Thames was still an artery of connection even after Rome was gone. Archaeologists have unearthed delicate glass vessels, imported pottery, and silver coins known as seatas, small but beautifully struck, showing that Lundenwic's people were part of a wider commercial web stretching from Scandinavia to the Frankish kingdoms. The town's location on a gravel terrace by the Thames allowed easy docking, and it grew fast enough that written sources began to mention it. By the mid-8th century, it was famous for its markets, a place where one could find anything from Baltic amber to Kentish wool. The historian Bede noted London's importance, describing it as a city on the bank of the Thames and the mart of many nations. But the river that connected also exposed. Its wide, navigable mouth was a highway for raiders. In 842, Viking longships appeared on the horizon. The Danes came not just for plunder, but for domination, slicing through the estuary like knives through silk. They attacked Londenwick repeatedly, burning, looting, vanishing back downriver before any organized defense could form. For the residents, the terror must have been overwhelming. The sound of oars, the red glow of torches reflected on water, the screams in the night. Even centuries later, chronicles remembered these incursions as moments of collective trauma. After years of such assaults, people began abandoning the exposed riverside settlement. And here, history performed one of its quiet circles. Survivors retreated eastward, back behind the ancient Roman walls that had stood empty for centuries. The ruins of Londinium became useful again, its stones offering protection from Viking fire. This reoccupation marked a turning point. The Roman city, once dead, breathed again, its skeleton reused by new hands. They patched up crumbling gates, built timber houses among collapsed basilicas, and raised small chapels beside moss-covered walls. The Reborn Londenberg, as it was now called, became both a fortress and a symbol of resilience. King Alfred the Great, ruling Wessex in the late 9th century, recognized the strategic value of London. In 886, after retaking it from the Danes, he refortified the old city and established it as a key defensive and administrative center. His charters speak of reorganizing land, repairing walls, and encouraging merchants to return. Alfred's efforts transformed London from a vulnerable market town into a bastion of order. For the first time since Rome, civic life returned under a strong king's hand. The contrast between Londenwick and Londenberg is striking: one open, organic, and vulnerable; the other disciplined, enclosed, and watchful. Yet both shared the same lifeblood trade. The Thames again filled with vessels, now broader, heavier, carrying wool salt and slaves. The markets revived inside the old walls, and a sense of continuity began to take hold. Even as Viking armies still prowled the rivers, London stood firm enough to serve as a royal mint and a political anchor in Alfred's growing network of fortified towns or burhs. Culturally, this was a moment of synthesis. Anglo-Saxon craft blended with Scandinavian artistry, giving rise to designs and words that still linger in English today. The city's skyline, if it could be called that, was a patchwork of timbered roofs, thatched barns, and newly built churches whose bells rang defiantly over muddy streets. St. Paul's Cathedral, first raised under the earlier bishop Mellitus, was rebuilt again under Alfred's protection, its modest spire a hopeful silhouette against smoky skies. And yet mystery remains about daily life during this rebirth. How many people actually lived here? Estimates range from 5 to 10,000, a small number by modern standards. but dense for its age. What did they eat? Bread made from coarse grain, salted fish, and perhaps imported wine for those with coin to spare. Their world smelled of tallow hearth smoke and the river's brine. It was dangerous, unpredictable, but undeniably alive again. One can almost see it, the mist rising over the Thames. At dawn, Alfred's soldiers patrolling the repaired walls, merchants hauling crates through narrow gates, and beyond the horizon, the glint of sails reminding everyone that peace was never permanent. The city had learned its defining lesson. Early London could never rely on safety, only on its ability to adapt, rebuild, and endure. The Vikings did not disappear after Alfred's victory. They lingered in the Thames estuary like ghosts who refused to leave the banquet, their longships drifting through fog, and their ambitions simmering beneath every uneasy truce. Even as Alfred's successors expanded their hold over England, the threat of the Northmen was never far from London's gates. The city, now firmly re-established within its Roman walls, had become both a prize and a fortress. For a time, it was ruled by English kings, but its markets still dealt freely with Norse traders who came upriver bearing silver amber and pelts, mixing conversation and commerce with those they had once raided. In that mingling of fear and familiarity, London's cosmopolitan nature began to take form. By the early 10th century, King Aethelstan, Alfred's grandson, rose to power and recognized London's strategic heart. He saw that whoever held London could command the country. Under his reign, the city grew into England's most important mint, producing coins stamped with royal authority. Guilds took shape to protect merchants and regulate quality. The streets that once echoed with Saxon shouts and Norse curses now rang with a new kind of energy economic ambition. If Alfred had rebuilt London's bones, Aethelstan gave it a heartbeat. Still that pulse beat under constant strain. The Thames remained a door that could swing both ways, welcoming trade or invasion. When the Danes returned under Swine Forkbeard in the early 11th century, the city's defenses were tested again. Contemporary chronicles describe how Swine's fleet surrounded London, but the fortified bridges and loyal citizens repelled the assault. It is said the Viking ships became entangled beneath the wooden bridge's supports, an event that may have inspired the old nursery rhyme, "London Bridge is falling down." History rarely preserves its humor, but this moment did. Even through war, the city's bridges, literal and symbolic, defined its fate. Then came the strange years of uneasy dual rule. The English king, Ethelred, the Unready, struggling to fend off Viking incursions, ordered desperate measures, including heavy taxes known as Danegeld payments, meant to buy peace. For London citizens, these were years of anxiety and contradiction. The same merchants who sold goods to Norse traders also helped fund the armies resisting them. The line between enemy and customer blurred. Yet this paradox bred resilience. Londoners learned to adapt to shifting powers without losing their core identity. In 1016, when the Danish prince Cnut the Great seized the English throne, London again stood at the center of change. Cnut understood the city's power and courted its loyalty rather than punishing it. Under his rule, London flourished as a royal capital, its port alive with ships from across the North Sea Empire, Denmark, Norway, even distant Baltic lands. Markets expanded, coinage stabilized, and the law courts began to take on the rhythm of bureaucratic permanence. Cnut worshipped at St. Paul's, blending Christian piety with Norse pragmatism, and his rule brought a decade of peace rare for the time. It is curious that a city built by Romans and revived by Saxons found one of its calmest moments under a Viking king. When Nut died in 1035, however, the balance unraveled. England fell into familiar chaos, and London once more became a stage for succession crises. Within a generation, Edward the Confessor took the throne and began reshaping the city in subtler spiritual ways. A deeply religious man raised in exile in Normandy, Edward introduced continental styles of architecture and administration. His most enduring gift to London was the founding of Westminster Abbey, built on the western marshes beyond the old city walls. The great church's construction turned that humble area, then a swampy island called Thorney, into a sacred and political nucleus. The Thames again served as the artery connecting old trade to new holiness. Imagine the contrast of the times within the walls, narrow lanes where smiths hammered metal and traders haggled. Upriver, the rising silhouette of Westminster's stone towers shimmering above reeds and mists. London was stretching outward for the first time, developing twin hearts. Commerce in the east, governance in the west. This dual identity, first visible in Edward's day, still defines the city, the practical and the ceremonial, the marketplace and the monarchy, the ledger and the crown. Edward's reign also set the stage for one of London's most dramatic chapters. As he aged without an heir, tension brewed between Anglo-Saxon nobles and Norman allies who whispered of their own claims. When Edward died in 1066, his burial in Westminster Abbey was followed almost immediately by a coronation, the crowning of Harold Godwinson. Yet even as the incense from Edward's funeral still hung in the air, sails appeared on the southern horizon. The Normans were coming. Before that fatal year ended, the Battle of Hastings would upend centuries of English rule. Harold fell, and William, Duke of Normandy, marched toward London. The city's leaders resisted briefly, but soon recognized reality. To prevent destruction, they opened their gates, and in Christmas, 1066, William was crowned king in Edward's still new abbey. The Norman conquest began not just with war, but with a quiet negotiation, a survival instinct Londoners had long mastered. From that moment, the city's story shifted again. The Normans brought stone castles, feudal order, and continental sophistication. The Tower of London rose as both fortress and warning, built upon the bones of Roman walls. Its white limestone gleamed against the soot-stained timber around it, a foreign accent carved into the skyline. Nearby, Norman lords built great halls, and new churches replaced older Saxon ones in the Romanesque style. French became the language of law and court, while English remained the tongue of markets and alleys. For the citizens living through this transition, it must have felt like waking in a familiar house whose rooms had all been rearranged overnight. The guilds endured, but they now answered to foreign masters. Taxes grew heavier, yet trade continued to swell. The city adapted as always, absorbing conquerors without ever losing its core pulse of enterprise. Within a century, the children of Norman knights and English merchants spoke a blended language, and London's cosmopolitan fabric deepened. Beneath the grandeur of conquest, life remained precarious. Fires swept through timber streets, and outbreaks of disease stalked the crowded lanes. The river, generous in trade, was merciless in flood. Yet each disaster left behind renewal. Rebuilt houses, improved docks, stronger walls. Even William's towering fortress, intended to subdue became part of the city's identity, a place of awe, fear, and permanence. The Normans did more than conquer England. They reinvented its very architecture of power, and London became their grand experiment. From the moment William the Conqueror claimed the crown within Westminster Abbey's candlelit nave, the city began to transform into the administrative and symbolic heart of a new regime. Stone replaced timber hierarchy, replaced custom, and London's skyline bristled with Norman ambition. The Tower of London, begun around 1078, stood as the ultimate expression of control, a fortress royal residence, and visible declaration that conquest was complete. It was not built to charm, but to intimidate gleaming white against the smoky skyline, its shadow stretching over the city like a silent command. To the Londoners who had lived through the invasion, the tower was both wonder and warning. Its thick walls were alien to English eyes, constructed from limestone, imported from Caen in Normandy, each block hauled across the Channel, as if the very bones of France were being implanted into England. Within its walls, royal guards patrolled, foreign masons labored, and the air smelled of dust and mortar instead of earth and oak. The building changed the psychology of the city. It told everyone who looked upon it that power had weight, and that weight was foreign. Even so, markets thrived in its shadow. Fishmongers shouted by the river's edge, wheelwrights hammered near the gate, and life carried on beneath the authority of the keep's white walls. William's reign tightened the mechanisms of rule. A vast survey, the Domesday Book of 1086, catalogued property taxes and people, ensuring that not even a pig escaped royal record. London itself, exempt from direct taxation by old charters, remained unique. The king recognized its value, not merely as a city, but as a treasury, and he allowed it to retain many of its liberties in exchange for loyalty and wealth. This arrangement would define the relationship between London and the crown for centuries, a delicate dance between dependence and defiance. Inside the city walls, Norman churches replaced Saxon ones. St. Paul's Cathedral was rebuilt in grand Romanesque style. After a fire, its new stone spire rising proudly above a maze of narrow, unpaved streets. Around it, guilds gained influence, organizing trades and regulating apprenticeships. Each guild had its hall, its feast day, its saints, and its secrets. The sound of London changed. The bells of St. Paul's mingled with the rhythmic toll of hammers, the bleating of livestock, and the clatter of carts over rough cobbles. The air was thick with smoke from forges and cooking fires, tinged with the sweet rot of the river. As London grew, so too did its contradictions. It was both the seat of royal splendor and the haven of restless merchants who chafed against foreign lords. Beneath the surface hum of prosperity, resentment simmered. When William's son, William Rufus, inherited the crown, his reign was marked by tension and revolt. The Tower served its intended purpose during these years, housing prisoners, deterring rebellion, and projecting control. Yet the city's power lay in its wealth, not its walls. Kings could command armies, but London commanded money. In that balance, the future was already being written. By the 12th century, London's population surged past 20,000, a teeming patchwork of English, Norman, Flemish, and Jewish communities. The Jewish population, invited by the Normans to serve as financiers, occupied a crucial niche in the city's economy. They lent to nobles and kings alike, for Christian law forbade usury. But this privilege came with peril. The Jewish quarter near modern-day Jury Street thrived for a time. Yet it was also a target in moments of unrest, a reminder that prosperity in medieval London was always fragile. One of the most remarkable transformations of this era was in architecture. Norman masons perfected the art of the rounded arch and vaulted stone, creating churches that felt eternal compared to their timber predecessors. London Bridge, previously a wooden structure, often damaged by fire and flood, began to evolve into stone under Henry II. Its construction became a metaphor for endurance, a link between the Roman past and the medieval future. Imagine the sound of chisels along the riverbank, the rhythmic crash of waves against scaffolding, the prayers whispered by builders before each dangerous ascent. In those sounds lay the heartbeat of a city determined to last. Henry III, William's youngest son, formalized London's privileges with a royal charter granting self-governance and protection of rights. It allowed the citizens to elect their own sheriffs and judge their own cases, an extraordinary concession in an age of centralized monarchy. This was the first hint of London's political independence, a seed that would one day grow into the proud autonomy of the City of London Corporation. The king had traded a little power for peace, not realizing that he had given the city a taste of freedom it would never relinquish. But peace was rarely London's natural state. Fires continued to ravage its cramped wooden quarters. The Great Fire of 1135, one of several that century, consumed vast stretches of homes, warehouses, and shops. The city's rebuilding was both weary and determined, every disaster prompting new layers of adaptation. The stone churches survived better than timber dwellings, further encouraging the transition to more permanent materials. Step by step, London learned the language of resilience. Amid this reconstruction, another force shaped the city's future pilgrimage. The relics of St. Erkenwald and later St. Thomas Becket drew streams of visitors, turning London into a spiritual waypoint as well as a commercial hub. Inns multiplied, taverns spread, and foreign traders arrived, not just for commerce, but for salvation. The mingling of languages, French English, Latin Norse, and others, made London a marketplace of voices. Here a baker might sell to a monk, a sailor might share ale with a scribe, and a thief might vanish into a crowd thick with accents. In such diversity, identity blurred. Londoner became a word defined less by birth than by belonging. The Thames, ever restless, reflected this transformation. Its surface carried barges laden with wool salt and wine, but also with the refuse of the poor and the ambitions of the rich. The smell could be foul, but the sight at sunset, masts, swaying gulls circling, and church spires glowing gold, was undeniably grand. For travelers arriving from the sea, the first glimpse of London was overwhelming, a city of towers, smoke, and shimmering promise, where power and profit mingled as naturally as the river's tides. By the late Norman period, the Crown's hold on England remained firm, but within London's walls, another kind of sovereignty had quietly emerged. The merchants' guilds, the church, and the city's elected officials had begun to wield influence that even kings could not ignore. A pattern was set that would echo for centuries. Monarchs might rule the realm, but London ruled itself. By the middle of the 12th century, London had become a city of contracts and contradictions. One part royal showcase, one part independent republic in spirit. Its Norman rulers had imposed a new political order, but the merchants and guilds quietly built an economy that belonged to no one but themselves. Stone houses now stood beside wooden ones, the sound of Latin chants from St. Paul's, mingling with the coarse laughter of fishwives near Billingsgate. The streets were alive with movement, donkeys hauling barrels, scribes rushing to record transactions, and pilgrims trudging toward Westminster. Yet beneath this pulse of trade and piety, something else was growing: the notion that London could govern itself, that its wealth and organization gave it authority apart from the crown. That idea found its first expression under King Stephen, whose reign from 1135 to 1154 was marked by chaos. His cousin Matilda, daughter of Henry I, contested his claim to the throne, plunging England into a civil war known simply as the Anarchy. Armies clashed across the countryside, castles changed hands, and for years there was no clear ruler. Yet in London, life continued. Merchants adjusted taxes, guilds maintained order, and civic officials balanced allegiance between rival claimants, depending on which promised better terms. The city had learned diplomacy born of survival. It sided not with bloodlines, but with stability. And while the countryside burned, London's markets stayed open, feeding both armies and pocketing profit from the confusion. It was during these uncertain years that the city's independence hardened into custom. The citizens elected their first Lord Mayor, Henry Fitzailwyn, under the later reign of Richard the Lionheart. Fitzailwyn was not a noble, but a wealthy merchant, a sign that London's strength lay in trade, not in titles. From that moment onward, the position became hereditary in spirit, if not in law, passed among the elite of the city's merchant families. The mayor presided from Guildhall, the new civic heart that symbolized London's corporate identity. Their charters were read aloud, disputes settled, and the mayor's chain, simple, then ceremonial, later represented the dignity of a self-made city. When Henry II ascended the throne in 1154, he recognized London's influence and granted further privileges to keep it loyal. The crown needed the city's money for crusades and wars, and London knew it. It extracted concessions, the right to collect its own taxes, to hold its own courts, and to regulate its trade. London became a financial organism, pulsing at the center of England's veins, its gold flowing outward to fund armies, cathedrals, and royal ambitions. And while kings came and went, London endured, counting coins beneath the arches of its counting houses. The 12th century also brought physical transformation. London Bridge, rebuilt in stone between 1176 and 1209, was the marvel of its age. It wasn't merely a crossing, it was a city unto itself. Houses, shops, and even a chapel crowned its length, turning the bridge into a bustling thoroughfare suspended over the water. Travelers crossing it could look upriver toward the gleaming towers of Westminster, or down toward the tower's white ramparts. Beneath, the current churned violently, slapping against the piers in rhythms that echoed through the city's imagination. The bridge became a symbol of London's paradox, precarious, yet enduring, mercantile, yet spiritual, noisy, yet unshakably strong. During this same era, the Cathedral of St. Paul's was rebuilt yet again. Now larger and grander, its soaring nave designed to match the ambitions of both faith and finance. It dominated the city's skyline, visible to sailors approaching from the estuary, and to peasants trudging in from the countryside. Inside, beneath vaults that seemed to reach heaven, bishops preached sermons to merchants who measured the length of the sermon against their business day. Faith was part of life, but business was its backbone. One cannot speak of 12th century London without touching on the contradictions of justice. The city's liberties made it prosperous, but they also made it unequal. While guildmasters dined in halls hung with banners, apprentices and labourers crowded into narrow alleys like Cock Lane and Soper's Lane, where the smell of tallow and refuse never quite faded. Disease found easy purchase there. Fires, too small ones, daily, great ones every few years, were part of the rhythm of existence. Yet the poor as always rebuilt with the same determination as their betters. In that resilience lay the seed of London's personality, industrious, practical, and never quite defeated. The reign of Henry II also brought intellectual renewal. His patronage of law and administration echoed in the city's courts, where the first notions of common law began to take shape. London's lawyers, many trained at the newly formed Inns of Court, learned to argue using precedent rather than royal whim. Here the rule of law became something tangible, a force that could in theory bind even kings. And although few in the alleys noticed it at the time, this quiet legal revolution would one day underpin the modern idea of civil liberty. Then came a wave of change that swept across Europe, the Crusades. When Richard the Lionheart took the cross, London's merchants financed his campaign. Gold and ships poured from the Thames docks to the Mediterranean. For their loyalty, Richard confirmed the city's charters and permitted the election of its own mayors without royal interference. The citizens of London celebrated his generosity with pageants and feasts, though they also knew that every favor could be revoked with the next monarch's temper. Yet each generation's success strengthened the next. The guilds grew richer, the city's coffers swelled. London had discovered the quiet alchemy of politics, how to turn royal need into civic privilege. But not all was prosperity. The shadow of prejudice darkened London in 1189 when violent anti-Jewish riots erupted during Richard's coronation. Homes were burned, lives were lost, and the fragile coexistence that had fueled the city's economy was shattered. The Jewish community, once integral to London's financial system, now lived in fear. Many fled. Others endured behind guarded doors. This tragedy marked a painful truth for all its progress. Medieval London remained vulnerable to ignorance and hysteria. And yet, even from ruin, it learned. The city's foreign traders, Italians, Flemish, and Hanseatic merchants, gradually filled the financial vacuum left behind, weaving new threads into the city's cosmopolitan fabric. By the century's end, London had become unmistakably medieval, crowded, smoky, and alive with ambition. The air smelled of coal and salt. The markets of Cheapside rang with shouting vendors, and boats jostled along the Thames like restless cattle. From dawn until curfew, bells marked the hours of work, prayer, and trade. The Tower's guards watched from their ramparts as foreign ships arrived under fluttering banners. The bridge's houses gleamed with candlelight, reflected in the river below. To a traveller from anywhere else in England, London must have seemed impossibly vast, a place where fortunes could rise in a day and disappear by nightfall. By the dawn of the 13th century, London's streets no longer felt like those of a conquered city. They were the arteries of a kingdom's ambition. Stone bridges, rising churches, and packed markets made it the envy of Europe. Yet beneath this outward prosperity stirred tension between king and city, a familiar duet that would play endlessly through English history. The crown demanded taxes. The city demanded autonomy. The merchants who gathered in Guildhall had grown confident, even defiant, and believed their prosperity gave them leverage equal to that of the throne. They were not wrong. When the king needed loans for war or ransom, London was his banker. When he overreached, the same merchants could tighten the purse strings until royal tempers cooled. King John, whose reign from 1199 to 1216 is remembered for greed and tyranny, pushed this balance to its limit. He taxed heavily, quarreled with the Pope, and lost Normandy to the French, humiliating the very nobles who had once supported him. In London, resentment brewed quietly. The city's guilds and aldermen watched as John confiscated lands, manipulated courts, and demanded forced loans from wealthy citizens. When rebellion finally erupted among the barons in 1215, London opened its gates to them. That single act, peaceful, strategic, and unashamed, changed English history. It was in London's open defiance that the barons found the leverage they needed to force John's hand at Runnymede. There beside the Thames, the Magna Carta was sealed, establishing that even the king was bound by law. Though the event took place miles from the city, London's fingerprints were all over it. One of the Magna Carta's most important clauses guaranteed the city its ancient liberties and free customs. It was an early recognition that London's self-rule was not a privilege, but a right born of centuries of service and loyalty. The citizens celebrated their triumph, though cautiously. They knew kings had short memories. Still, it was a declaration that London was not simply a possession of the crown, but a partner in the kingdom's governance. When King John died the following year, his 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited both the throne and his father's debts. For London, this meant negotiation, not rebellion. The city lent money, provided troops, and in return demanded reaffirmation of its charters. Henry, pragmatic and eager for stability, obliged. He also turned his attention to building, most famously expanding, Westminster Abbey in the Gothic style, a work of spiritual grandeur that would later host coronations for nearly every English monarch. To fund his vision, Henry relied on London's wealth-taxing trade and borrowing from Italian bankers who had replaced the expelled Jews as the kingdom's financiers. Thus, the city's gold poured into stone-shaping monuments that would define England's identity, yet prosperity was shadowed by catastrophe. In 1216, as French forces invaded in support of the rebellious barons, London was besieged. Though the city survived, it suffered heavy losses. Then came fire. Medieval London was built largely of timber, with overhanging upper floors that turned narrow lanes into chimneys. Flames leapt from house to house with terrifying speed. The fire of 1212 was especially brutal. It began on London Bridge, where the wind carried sparks both north and south, trapping people between walls of flame. Chronicles speak of hundreds, perhaps thousands, perishing, many falling into the river below. When it was over, the bridge's houses were charred skeletons, the smell of smoke lingering for weeks. Yet as always, the city rebuilt. Fire was not London's only torment. Disease crept in with equal ferocity. The growing population, perhaps 80,000 souls, by mid-century, lived packed into alleys so narrow that neighbors could shake hands from opposite windows. Chamber pots emptied onto streets. Refuse rolled downhill toward the Thames. The smell in summer was nearly unbearable. Rats thrived, as did fleas. When the Black Death arrived in 1348, carried by ships docking at the river, it found fertile ground. Within months, London was a city of silence. Entire parishes vanished. Grass grew in market squares. Bells tolled endlessly until there were no hands left to ring them. Some estimates suggest half the city's population perished. It was death on an incomprehensible scale, And yet London endured. Survival was not merely luck. The city's institutions, its guilds, its courts, its clergy maintained a skeleton of order even in crisis. They organized burials, distributed arms, and recorded property so that commerce could one day resume. When the plague finally receded, London emerged scarred but alive. Those who remained found opportunity amid ruin. Wages rose, land changed hands, and a new merchant class gained prominence. The social fabric rewove itself thread by pragmatic thread. Through the 13th and 14th centuries, the city's architecture shifted toward permanence. Stone houses replaced timber ones in wealthy districts like Cheapside and Cornhill. The Tower expanded with new walls and bastions. St. Paul's grew still higher, its spire a needle piercing the smoky sky. The guilds, ever more powerful, began sponsoring chapels and charities, intertwining faith with commerce. Their banners depicting goldsmiths, fishmongers, tailors, and vintners hung proudly in processions that blended devotion with civic pride. London was learning to celebrate itself, to craft pageantry from survival. The Thames remained its lifeblood. Every dawn the river filled with boats, grain from Essex wine from Bordeaux, timber from the Baltic. Barges crowded the wharves, their crews shouting in a dozen tongues. The river was both boundary and bond, the line that divided and united rich and poor, foreigner and native. It carried plague wealth and rumor with equal ease. On its surface, reflected the contradictions of the city squalor, beside splendor, greed, beside faith. Yet even as London's wealth grew, discontent brewed. Taxes for the king's wars in France strained every purse. Corruption flourished in royal officials, and resentment found its voice among craftsmen and apprentices. When in 1381 the Peasants Revolt swept through England, London again stood at the center. Thousands of rebels, led by Wat Tyler, marched on the city demanding justice, fair wages, and an end to feudal oppression. They entered through open gates. Sympathetic citizens had let them in, and for days chaos ruled. The rebels stormed the tower, killing officials and burning records. But their victory was brief. The young King Richard II met them at Smithfield, and through deception and force restored order. The revolt ended in blood, yet its message lingered. London's poor had found a voice, however quickly it was silenced. When dawn rose over the Thames in the early 16th century, the water no longer reflected only the towers of guild halls and cathedrals. It shimmered with royal banners. London was now the stage upon which a new kind of monarchy strutted, bold, theatrical, and hungry for loyalty. The Tudor age had arrived, and with it the city's relationship with power changed forever. The crown no longer hovered above London. It lived within it. The capital became the beating heart of royal spectacle and policy. A place where ambition was draped in velvet, and the murmur of markets blended with the whisper of intrigue. Henry VII, the first Tudor, had seized the throne through blood and cleverness. His son Henry VIII would reshape it with ego and faith. In Henry VIII's London, the air itself seemed charged. The population swelled past 100,000, spilling beyond the old walls into new suburbs like Shoreditch, Southwark, and Westminster. Timber houses leaned precariously over alleys that hummed with gossip laughter and the ever-present clang of industry. On feast days, the streets blazed with banners, trumpets, and dancing. On ordinary mornings, one could hear the clatter of carts on cobblestones and smell the mingled odors of bread dung smoke and perfume. Beneath this lively surface pulsed a deeper current of tension. The king, immense in personality and appetite, was at war with his own church. The Reformation arrived in London, not as a sermon, but as a shockwave. When Henry broke with Rome in the 1530s, dissolving monasteries and claiming their wealth, London became both the beneficiary and the battlefield. The city's skyline changed almost overnight. Monastic houses that had stood for centuries, Blackfriars, Greyfriars, Charterhouse, were seized their lands, sold their libraries, scattered. The stone of demolished cloisters was carted away to build new palaces and wharves. The city grew richer from the spoils, but spiritually it fractured. Processions of monks vanished, their bells fell silent. In their place, royal proclamations echoed through Cheapside, warning against heresy one week and treason the next. The people adapted as they always did. Printers along Fleet Street began producing English Bibles and reformist tracts, feeding the new hunger for knowledge. In taverns and workshops, debates over scripture mixed with talk of trade and taxes. The tavern, as much as the church, became a center of thought. Yet the freedom of belief was illusory. Henry's temper was legendary. Those who strayed too far from his version of truth found themselves paraded through the streets to the Tower, their heads soon decorating London Bridge. The Tower, once a Norman fortress, had become a grim theater of power, its walls echoing with the footsteps of those who had once dined beside the king. Anne Boleyn, the queen who changed England's faith, entered the Tower through the Traitor's Gate in 1536. From its courtyard, she could see the river glittering beneath the same sunlight that had once reflected her coronation barges. Within days, she would die there, beheaded by a French swordsman summoned for precision and spectacle. London watched in horrified fascination. The people had seen queens crowned, but now they saw one undone before their eyes. It was a reminder that in Tudor London, even the highest station was no protection from the whims of royal desire. Despite these storms, the city thrived. The dissolution of monasteries freed vast tracts of land for private use. Merchants and nobles bought former church estates, building grand houses with gardens stretching toward the river. The rise of merchant dynasties like the Greshams and Cecils transformed London's economy. Wealth from wool trade and overseas ventures poured in funding not just mansions, but theatres, schools and hospitals. St. Bartholomew's Hospital, spared from Henry's destruction, was re-endowed by citizens who saw civic charity as both moral duty and social insurance. Under Edward VI and Mary, London swung wildly between Protestant zeal and Catholic revival. The fires of Smithfield burned with martyrs under Mary's reign, staining the air with the acrid scent of conviction. Yet even persecution could not slow the city's momentum. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1558, she inherited a restless, brilliant, dangerous metropolis. The Virgin Queen, pragmatic and perceptive, understood London's dual nature. It was both her throne and her mirror. She ruled it with a mixture of affection and intimidation, rewarding loyalty with privilege and rebellion with ruin. Elizabeth's reign transformed London into the intellectual and artistic capital of Europe. Theatres, like the Curtain and the Globe, rose on the South Bank outside the city's jurisdiction, but close enough for crowds to pour across the bridge. There, beneath open skies, Shakespeare and Marlowe staged the contradictions of their age, love and power, faith and ambition, laughter beside death. The Thames became both a stage and an audience. its waters reflecting torchlight and echoing with applause. To walk through Elizabethan London was to feel that the entire city had become an act of imagination, every street a story, every inn a plot waiting to unfold. At the same time, the city's reach expanded across the seas. The Royal Exchange, founded by Thomas Gresham in 1565, formalized international trade. Merchants gathered beneath its arcades to discuss prices of spices from the Indies, silk from China, and sugar from the Caribbean. London's ambitions stretched far beyond England's shores. Ships sailed from the Pool of London, bearing flags of exploration and exploitation. The city's prosperity was now tied to the global winds, its fortunes rising and falling with the tide of empire. But for ordinary Londoners, life remained precarious. Theatres and taverns flourished beside plague pits. Prosperity coexisted with poverty. In 1563, a devastating plague outbreak killed a quarter of the population. The dead were carted through the streets at night, their bodies buried in pits beyond the walls. The stench of lime and smoke hung over the city for months. Yet even as death swept through the alleys, the presses kept printing, and the theatres reopened as soon as the danger waned. The city's resilience bordered on defiance, its people refusing to pause as though motion itself were protection. By the final years of Elizabeth's reign, London had become both myth and reality, a place of dazzling brilliance and shadowed cruelty. Its river carried spices, silver, and slaves. Its churches rang with hymns of faith and fear. From the palace at Whitehall to the prisons of Southwark power and poverty, met face to face every day. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the city mourned genuinely. For all her imperiousness, she had made London feel like the center of the world. Her funeral procession stretched for miles, the air thick with incense and tears. Along the Thames boats, draped in black, moved silently beneath the same arches that had once borne her triumphs. The new century opened with a funeral and a coronation, when James VI of Scotland rode south to become James III of England in 1603. London greeted him not as a conqueror, but as the inheritor of its boundless ambition. The Tudor flame had dimmed, but the embers still glowed. Streets were hung with garlands, crowds cheered, and the air carried the smell of spring rain and horse sweat as the procession passed beneath triumphal arches erected by guilds and poets alike. A single city now bound the two kingdoms, its river a silver thread tying together a union of crowns. Yet beneath the pomp, London still carried the scars of plague, poverty, and unease, its people wary of kings who promised peace but brought new uncertainty. James was no Henry or Elizabeth. Where they had ruled through charisma, he ruled through theory. His belief in divine kingship set him at odds with a populace increasingly literate, skeptical, and self-aware. London, more than any other city in Europe, was a mirror of this new consciousness. Printing presses thrived, flooding taverns and parlors with pamphlets debating faith governance and human reason. The Stationers' Company tried to regulate the torrent, but ideas flowed like the Thames, impossible to dam. If the medieval city had spoken in bells, this new London murmured in ink. Theatres, too, reached their golden age. The Globe. The Rose and the Fortune were more than entertainment. They were laboratories of language and empathy. Londoners gathered by the thousands to see Shakespeare's King Lear howl on a stage not far from the roar of the real river. These plays held up a mirror to a world in transition. Kings questioned fools, spoke truth, and ambition drove both ruin and renewal. The audiences were diverse merchants, nobles, apprentices, even spies. A city that had once prayed in Latin now dreamed in blank verse. Yet the early Stuart years were not only an age of words, they were an age of masks. The royal court at Whitehall shimmered with pageantry masks designed by Inigo Jones' music by John Dowland, and banquets that blended artistry and arrogance. The king's favorites strutted through chambers lined with tapestries depicting biblical order, an irony not lost on those who saw corruption beneath the gold. London's commoners grumbled about taxes and favoritism, while Puritans preached against the moral decay of theatres and wine-houses. The city pulsed with contradiction, outwardly loyal, inwardly restless. Then in 1605 came a shock that froze the capital. A plot hatched in the shadows of Westminster to blow up Parliament and the king himself, the Gunpowder Plot. Its discovery transformed London overnight. Bonfires roared in the streets, bells rang out, and effigies of Guy Fawkes burned by the river. Fear turned to fervour. Yet even this brush with annihilation could not shake the city's rhythm. Within days, merchants returned to trade, and printers sold cheap broadsheets recounting the drama with lurid detail. London absorbed the event, as it absorbed everything turning danger into narrative catastrophe, into commerce. The decades that followed saw both prosperity and plague. James's rule brought peace with Spain, reviving overseas trade. Ships bearing tobacco from Virginia and silk from the East India Company's ventures crowded the Thames. Wharves at Deptford and Wapping buzzed with activity. Fortunes were made and lost with each tide. Yet behind the bustle, poverty deepened. The city's population doubled to nearly 300,000, overflowing the medieval walls into sprawling suburbs. Narrow alleys like Whitechapel and Clerkenwell filled with labourers and beggars. For every merchant counting coins in candlelight, a dozen others shivered outside in the cold. The same streets that echoed with sermons of salvation also carried the cries of hunger. Then came the plague again in 1625, claiming tens of thousands. Red crosses appeared on doors, carts rolled through silent lanes, and the bells of St. Paul's tolled until the clappers broke. The smell of vinegar, used to ward off infection, hung thick in the air. Whole parishes emptied, leaving grass sprouting between cobblestones. Yet when the sickness ebbed, London did what it always did: rebuilt, repopulated, and returned to business. Survival was its creed. Memory was a luxury it could not afford. When Charles I succeeded his father, he brought charm and vision, but also arrogance. His belief in absolute authority collided with a populace that had tasted too much freedom. London's merchants resented his taxes. Its Puritans scorned his bishops. Its parliamentarians questioned his divine right. For a time, pageantry disguised the cracks. Inigo Jones redesigned the banqueting house, and Van Dyck's portraits glowed with serene confidence. But beneath the paint, unease festered. By the 1640s, those cracks split open into civil war. The English Civil War was in many ways born in London streets. Parliament sat within its walls. Pamphlets calling for reform poured from its presses. The city's wealth armed the parliamentary cause, while its people provided the voice of dissent. London became the capital of resistance against its own king. Soldiers drilled in its fields. Preachers thundered from its pulpits. Outside the city, royalist troops gathered, but London's fortifications held firm earthworks, and cannons ringing it like a clenched fist. When Charles was captured and brought to trial, it was London that bore witness. The execution of a king in 1649 shocked the world. Crowds gathered before Whitehall Palace in stunned silence as the blade fell. A gasp, then stillness. The monarchy was gone, and the city, its uneasy accomplice, was left to make sense of what it had done. For a brief radical moment, London became the heart of a republic. Markets opened, theatres closed, and Puritan austerity blanketed the streets. The taverns grew quiet, the river traffic thinned. It was a sober, joyless peace. Yet repression could never entirely extinguish London's spirit. Even under Cromwell's Commonwealth, smuggled plays circulated, clandestine dances persisted, and coffee houses sprouted as new arenas of debate. In those dimly lit rooms, over bitter brews imported from the Ottoman world, merchants and philosophers spoke of trade routes, science, and liberty. The modern mind was forming restless, skeptical, caffeinated. The year 1665 began with the soft patter of rain over thatched roofs, but soon the air grew heavy with dread. Whispers spread through the taverns of Shoreditch and the markets of Cheapside, whispers of a pestilence returning. It began quietly, a handful of deaths, in St. Giles in the Fields, dismissed at first as rumor or exaggeration. Londoners had heard such talk before, and the city had always survived. But by summer, the churchyards were full, and the bells rang without rest. The Great Plague had come. The smell of death clung to everything. Physicians in long beaked masks trudged through deserted lanes, their pouches filled with herbs and vinegar. Red crosses marked infected houses. The words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," were smeared across doors in chalk. The living fled if they could. Coaches jammed the roads leading from Aldgate and Holborn as the wealthy escaped to the countryside. Within weeks, London was half empty. Grass sprouted between cobblestones, and silence replaced the clamour of carts. The poor, trapped by circumstance, huddled in their homes as the plague carts rolled by at night, their drivers calling through the gloom, "Bring out your dead." At its peak, the epidemic killed thousands each week. The stench of lime pits mingled with the smoke of constant fires set to purify the air. Diaries from the time describe ghostly streets, dogs roaming freely, and the eerie tolling of bells from empty churches. Yet even amid despair, life persisted. Watchmen guarded quarantined houses, clergy delivered food through windows, and printers, ever defiant, kept publishing accounts of miracles, prophecies, and dubious cures. Fear itself became an industry. When the death toll began to fall, that autumn survivors stumbled out to find a city, hollowed yet alive, a ghost wearing the mask of its former self. It began in the small hours of Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, in the bakery of Thomas Farriner on Pudding Lane. A spark leapt to timber beams. A servant's cry echoed through the narrow passageways, and within minutes, the flames found their path through the dry, crowded streets. The summer had been long and hot, leaving the city as combustible as a thatched tinderbox. When the wind rose from the east, the fire leapt from house to house, climbing roofs and crossing alleys. By dawn, it had become an inferno. Imagine the sight, the sky an unbroken sheet of orange, the air thick with ash. People poured from their homes, clutching what little they could, Bibles, portraits, chamber pots, while carts overturned in the panic. The Thames became a mirror of fire, reflecting the burning skyline as boats, crammed with refugees, drifted towards safety. St. Paul's Cathedral, once thought indestructible, became a blazing furnace, its great dome collapsing in a roar that shook the city like thunder. The sound of its fall was said to echo for miles. For 4 days and nights, the fire devoured London. It consumed churches, warehouses, and homes alike. The heat melted lead-shattered glass and turned stone into powder. Sparks carried by the wind set even the riverfront alight. Samuel Pepys, the ever-curious diarist, rode out onto the Thames to witness the destruction, writing that the very pavement glowed red beneath my feet. When at last the flames died, they had erased nearly 4/5 of the medieval city, more than 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and countless dreams. And yet in that sea of ruin, London found the strange opportunity that always followed its disasters, the chance to begin again. The air, though smoky and foul, smelled also of wet stone and renewal. The ashes cooled, and out of them stepped visionaries. Sir Christopher Wren, mathematician and architect, walked through the blackened streets, sketching ideas for a new city, a city of light, order, and grace. His plans imagined broad boulevards and piazzas in the continental style, but practicality and private property soon tamed his vision. Londoners wanted their homes rebuilt quickly, not perfectly. Still, Wren left his mark. More than 50 churches rose under his hand, and atop Ludgate Hill, a new St. Paul's began to rise its dome, a symbol of rebirth. Rebuilding London was a monumental task. Parliament passed new building codes, mandating brick and stone construction to prevent future fires. Streets were widened, open spaces introduced. The old medieval maze gave way partially to a cleaner, more rational order. Skilled craftsmen from across England came to work their hammers, echoing day and night. Within a decade, the city gleamed again, red roofs glinting above the river, its scars hidden beneath fresh facades. It was a phoenix in human form, blackened wings still smoking, but already stretching skyward. In this new London, coffee houses became the heart of conversation. Each catered to a different clientele: merchants at Lloyd's, writers at Will's, politicians at Garraway's. Over steaming cups of the bitter exotic brew deals were struck poems debated and revolutions whispered. From these smoky rooms emerged modern journalism, stock trading, and even insurance. A man could buy coffee in the morning and sell a fleet by afternoon. London's resilience had turned to invention, but the fire had done more than reshape the skyline. It had reshaped the city's spirit. Having seen death from plague and ruin from flame, Londoners became pragmatic dreamers, skeptical, industrious, and unshakable. They lived with one eye on profit and the other on survival. Their humor turned dry, their faith practical. Even in the poorest alleys, there was pride and endurance. The rebuilding gave artisans work architects fame and the crown glory. Charles II, though not always beloved, oversaw this rebirth with theatrical flair, declaring that a city so consumed by fire shall yet rise fairer than ever she hath been. For once a king's boast was true. By the century's close, the skyline had transformed. Wren's new St. Paul's dominated the horizon, its dome glowing pale gold in the morning mist. Around it, steeples pierced the sky like needles. Along the river, rebuilt warehouses brimmed with goods from across the world: sugar, tobacco, silk, tea. London had not only survived, it had entered a new age of confidence. The smell of ash was gone, replaced by salt, spice, and ambition. Out of the ashes of the Great Fire, London entered an age of vision. The 17th century's final decades became a time of rebuilding, not just in stone, but in mind, a rebirth of confidence so profound that it reshaped how the city thought of itself. The skyline that had glowed red with destruction now glimmered with copper domes and white steeples. It was a city rediscovering grace. Christopher Wren's great masterpiece, St. Paul's Cathedral, rose slowly from the rubble, its curve expanding year by year, a serene answer to the chaos that had once devoured the old medieval maze. Londoners watched it rise like a promise that even in this restless place, something eternal might stand. The streets below told a different story. Rebuilt in brick, lined with shops and taverns, they buzzed with energy. The new city was cleaner, wider, better drained, and better governed. Fire had forced order upon disorder. And yet, for all its polished facades, London remained a place of contrast, its elegance only inches from its crime. The court of Charles II danced and drank at Whitehall, while a few streets away, apprentices huddled in garrets, counting their meagre wages. The Restoration had restored joy, but not justice. Still, the city thrived, for Londoners had long learned to measure progress, not in fairness, but in survival. In this reborn London, ideas burned even brighter than candles. Coffee houses, once curiosities, became essential to the city's identity. Within their smoke-filled rooms, merchants, writers, scientists, and sailors mingled freely. At Jonathan's Coffee House, the first stockbrokers crowded around ledgers that would one day become the London Stock Exchange. At Lloyd's, shipowners gathered to insure voyages, giving birth to the world's most famous insurance market. At Will's, poets, like Dryden, traded barbs and epigrams, while clerks listened, dreaming of publication. The chatter of these rooms replaced the old street cries. Debate became the new music of the city. Knowledge, too, found a home. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, gave London a temple of curiosity. Men like Robert Hooke, Christopher Wren, and Isaac Newton met to discuss experiments with air pumps, telescopes, and prisms, dissecting nature with the same precision that Wren applied to his arches. Nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, was their motto, and it suited London perfectly. Skeptical, practical, and ambitious, the city had turned inquiry into habit. Science and commerce now walked hand in hand along the Thames, their partnership destined to change the world. The political world, however, was less harmonious. Charles II's easy charm could not conceal the deep religious and ideological fractures that remained after civil war. His successor, James II, a Catholic in a Protestant nation, ignited them once more. London watched uneasily as James attempted to strengthen royal power and restore Catholic tolerance. Riots fled, pamphlets multiplied, and once again the city became a battlefield of words. When William of Orange landed in 1688, bringing the so-called Glorious Revolution, London greeted him not with blood, but with bonfires. The people had learned that revolutions need not always burn. They could simply open the gates. The revolution reshaped the balance of English life. The crown survived, but Parliament triumphed, and London, where Parliament sat and commerce thrived, became the true heart of governance. The financial system that would define the modern world began here. The Bank of England was founded in 1694, a fortress of credit that turned paper promises into power. Its grey facade rose near the old Roman wall, a fitting symbol of continuity and reinvention. From its ledgers would flow the loans that built fleets, funded wars, and expanded empire. For the first time, wealth could be counted not in gold alone, but in confidence. A concept London understood better than any city alive. The dawn of the 18th century found London humming with optimism. The streets gleamed with oil lamps. Sedan chairs jostled for space beside carts and carriages. Along the Strand, new theatres opened. In Covent Garden, fruit sellers cried their wares under canopies of painted canvas. Music drifted from taverns, where fiddlers played for sailors newly arrived from distant ports. The air smelled of coffee tar and opportunity. Wren's churches dotted the skyline like punctuation marks, in a sentence that seemed to have no end. But prosperity brought new vices. Gin cheap and potent flooded the poorer quarters. Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for two, the slogans went. Artists like William Hogarth captured the chaos, gaunt mothers feeding infants, gin thieves pickpocketing the fallen. The same city that produced philosophers and financiers also produced beggars and brothels. It was a duality London never escaped: enlightenment and excess refinement, and ruin sharing the same breath. And yet, for all its contradictions, this era gave the city its defining confidence. The rebuilt St. Paul's was completed in 1710, and when its final stone was laid, crowds gathered in reverent silence. For generations afterward, the dome would serve as London's compass, visible from every hill, every ship, every dream. Inside, Wren's simple epitaph still speaks for the city itself. Si monumentum requiris circumspice. If you seek his monument, look around you. Every brick, every street, every heartbeat of London was his monument. In the decades that followed, life found its rhythm again. The plague was gone fire, a memory civil war, a cautionary tale. The city had rebuilt itself, not merely in form, but in function. Banks replaced barons, merchants replaced knights, and reason replaced divine right. London was no longer just a capital. It was a prototype for the modern world. Its docks pulsed with global trade. Its presses shaped opinion across continents. Beneath its rain-streaked roofs, the world's future was being drafted in ledgers, letters, and laws. At night, the city glowed softly. Lamplight trembling on wet cobblestones, the murmur of the Thames rolling through arches and alleys. St. Paul's dome caught the moonlight serene and eternal. Somewhere, a coach wheel splashed through puddles, a violin played behind shuttered windows, and the wind carried the faint scent of smoke and spice. London was alive again, but never still. It had learned to build beauty upon ruin, reason upon faith, and hope upon ash. The dawn of the 18th century found London expanding faster than any city in Europe, its heartbeat measured not by bells or cannons, but by trade. The rebuilt capital of brick and stone had become a living machine of commerce. Its arteries, the Thames, its pulse, the Bank of England, and its lifeblood, the endless traffic of goods. Ships from the Caribbean, the Americas, Africa, and Asia lined the docks at Wapping and Rotherhithe. Bales of tobacco, sugar tea, and cotton were hauled ashore beside casks of rum and barrels of gunpowder. The smell of salt tar and spice hung in the air, a perfume of empire. London was no longer merely England's city. It was becoming the world's. The new economy birthed new classes. Merchants grew rich, investors richer still, while artisans and dock workers swelled the ranks of the poor. The gap between wealth and want yawned wider with every ship that unloaded its cargo. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair chandeliers sparkled over talk of stocks and speculation. In the alleys of Whitechapel, gin-soaked voices cursed the cold. The same empire that filled London's coffers filled its slums. Wealth flowed one way, labor the other. Yet the city thrived on contradiction. Its genius lay in turning inequity into energy. The rise of finance defined the century. The Bank of England, founded in 1694 to stabilize royal debt, became the heart of a new system of credit. Paper replaced coin. Promises replaced gold. Men in powdered wigs whispered fortunes over cups of coffee at Jonathan's Exchange. The stock market was young and unregulated, a theatre of hope and ruin. When the South Sea bubble burst in 1720, it ruined thousands from nobles to shopkeepers. Pamphlets mocked the mania. Every fool a merchant, every merchant a fool. Yet even ruin could not stop the machine. Within a year, trading resumed. London had discovered the curious comfort of collapse. It was never fatal, only instructive. Above this fevered economy, culture flourished. Theatres reopened with grandeur. Drury Lane, Covent Garden, and Haymarket drew crowds from every class. The plays of Congreve and Sheridan dripped with wit and scandal, while Italian opera enthralled the elite. Handel's Messiah, first performed in London, filled churches and concert halls, with celestial sound uniting aristocrats and apprentices in a rare harmony. The coffee house became the Republic of Talk. The theatre, the Republic of Laughter. The city that once burned for faith, now burned for conversation. Intellect and satire ruled the age. Writers like Daniel Defoe and Jonathan Swift turned London streets into ink mapping, hypocrisy, ambition, and survival with biting clarity. Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year resurrected the horrors of 1665 for readers who now viewed them through the glass of irony and commerce. Swift's Gulliver's Travels, though fantastical, was a mirror held to the politics and vanity of the capital itself. In their words, London recognized its own absurd grandeur, the world's marketplace of ideas, sins, and dreams. Even the city's moral conscience took organized form. In 1751, the Foundling Hospital opened, providing refuge for abandoned infants, a response to the cruelty of poverty laid bare by writers and artists. The philanthropist Thomas Coram had campaigned for decades to build it, joined by Handel and Hogarth, who lent their art and fame. Their collaboration captured London's paradox, a metropolis of vice capable of immense virtue. The Foundling Hospital became both a sanctuary and a symbol proof that compassion could survive in a city powered by greed. While philanthropy soothed the conscience, progress satisfied the mind. The Royal Society and its offshoots nurtured the age of enlightenment. Benjamin Franklin strolled through London's rain-slick streets, experimenting with electricity. Joseph Banks catalogued specimens brought back by explorers. Booksellers lined Paternoster Row, their shelves crowded with volumes that carried the light of reason into every household that could read. Science and skepticism became as fashionable as lace cuffs and powdered wigs. Yet enlightenment cast new shadows. The wealth that made London gleam was built partly on the backs of enslaved people across the Atlantic. Sugar and rum sweetened the tables of Mayfair, but were born of human misery. The city's merchants knew this, but profit dulled conscience. Slavery's footprint in London was invisible, but vast, hidden in bank ledgers, insurance contracts, and the quiet anonymity of imported luxury. The streets of Bloomsbury and Belgravia would later rest upon fortunes minted in bondage. By mid-century, London had swelled to over 700,000 souls, more than the next 6 English cities combined. It was an urban planet unto itself. The new Georgian squares of Bloomsbury, Bedford, and Hanover glittered with symmetry and polish. Palladian mansions rose behind wrought iron gates, but beyond them, the East End festered an ocean of narrow alleys, open drains, and endless hunger. The city was as divided as it was united an empire of both elegance and exhaustion. And yet it was irresistibly alive. The Thames flowed with commerce by day and reflections by night. Lanterns flickered along Westminster Bridge. Couples promenaded under the moonlight. Barges glided between piers, carrying goods and gossip. Every sound, the clop of hooves, the cry of hawkers, the whistle of wind between new stone facades, spoke of a metropolis confident in its destiny. That confidence reached a fever pitch during the reign of George III. London hosted coronations, operas, riots, and revolutions of thought. When the American colonies rebelled in 1776, news spread first through the coffee houses. Opinions divided, but the city's merchants calculated profit rather than loyalty. War was simply another form of business, and when the colonies won, London barely paused. It simply turned its eyes east to India, to Africa, to anywhere profit might still bloom. By a century's end, London had outgrown its medieval shell entirely. Turnpikes radiated outward, connecting it to a countryside already changing under the early rumblings of industry. Canals and warehouses stretched toward Paddington and Limehouse. The city had become not just a seat of government, but the engine of a global economy. The first modern world was quietly assembling itself on the banks of the Thames, brick by brick, loan by loan. The turn of the 19th century arrived with the sound of hammers and hooves. London had never stopped building, but now it began to accelerate beyond imagination. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping Britain, and though its furnaces burned brightest in the Midlands and the North, the capital, was its mind planning, financing, and commanding the engines that changed the world. Smoke no longer came only from hearths. It rose from factories, mingling with the river fog, until the sky itself seemed forged of iron. To walk through London in 1800 was to feel the weight of progress pressing down the streets louder, the crowds thicker, the air alive with invention and anxiety. The population had passed 1 million, and the city stretched far beyond its medieval boundaries. Suburbs like Marylebone, Islington, and Southwark swelled with new residents. Carriages and carts clogged the narrow roads. Beggars jostled with bankers beneath the same grey drizzle. The new Georgian terraces stood immaculate in their symmetry rows of identical facades, masking wildly different fortunes behind their doors. On one street, silk and candlelight. On the next, soot and hunger. The gulf between rich and poor, already wide, deepened until it seemed as permanent as the Thames itself. And the Thames, oh, it stank. By 1800, it had become both artery and sewer. Barges loaded with coal manure and refuse plied its brown surface. The tides dragged waste through the city like a sluggish vein carrying poison. Yet still, it was beautiful in its way. Painters like Turner found poetry in its haze, the sun diffused through the mist ships emerging like ghosts, and the glow of lanterns trembling on oily water. London's filth was its muse. War shaped the century's opening decades. Napoleon's shadow loomed across the Channel, and London bristled with patriotism. Recruitment posters plastered tavern walls. Newspapers cried for victory. Factories churned out uniforms and guns. When the news of Trafalgar reached the city in 1805, bells rang and bonfires blazed from Whitechapel to Westminster. Yet even triumph could not still the unease. The Industrial Revolution had unleashed machines that replaced workers, and soldiers returning from war found their jobs gone. Poverty gathered like storm clouds. Philanthropists and reformers tried to stem the tide. In 1799, The first modern police force, the Bow Street Runners, patrolled the streets, though crime still thrived in the alleys. Evangelicals founded missions and Sunday schools. Reformers, like William Wilberforce, campaigned against slavery, culminating in its abolition across the British Empire in 1833. Yet London's conscience remained selective. The same empire that ended the slave trade abroad still relied on exploitative labor, at-home child chimney sweeps, starving weavers, and factory hands working 16-hour days. Progress was rarely kind. As industry boomed, so too did intellect. The coffee houses evolved into clubs. Salons and societies flourished. The Royal Institution, founded in 1799, hosted dazzling public lectures, where Humphrey Davy and later Michael Faraday demonstrated the mysteries of electricity. Audiences gasped as sparks danced between copper spheres, lighting the faces of lords and labourers alike. Knowledge had become spectacle, and London its stage. But for most, survival was the real experiment. The East End grew denser, darker, its streets choked with lodging houses and workhouses. The city's poor lived in conditions that shocked even hardened travellers. Children scavenged in gutters for coal. Mothers queued for hours at parish soup kitchens. In contrast, the West End glittered. Regent Street, laid out by John Nash, led to the new Regent's Park, a landscape of elegance and restraint, designed to tame nature as industry tamed chaos. The contrast between these two Londons, the glittering and the grim, would soon define the Victorian conscience. The 1830s brought reform and unrest. The Great Reform Act of 1832 expanded parliamentary representation, giving London's middle class a louder voice, though the working class remained unheard. Meanwhile, cholera swept through the city in 1832, and again in 1849, carried by the same filthy water that sustained life. Doctors debated whether it came from miasma or contagion, but the poor already knew it came from neglect. The smell of the Thames in summer was unbearable, a stench so powerful it could empty Parliament itself, as it would famously do during the Great Stink of 1858. Even in its filth, London fascinated the world. Writers and artists turned misery into meaning. Charles Dickens, walking the streets by gaslight, transmuted poverty into prose. His novels, Oliver Twist, Bleak House, Little Dorrit, made the invisible visible, the orphans, pickpockets, clerks and dreamers who filled the city's labyrinth. Through his eyes, London became a character in itself, vast, cruel, compassionate, and immortal. Railways arrived, slicing through neighborhoods and time. By mid-century, steam engines thundered into new stations at Euston King's Cross and Paddington. The city that once took hours to cross could now be traversed in minutes. The suburbs expanded outward like ripples drawing the middle class away from the smoke. London became both larger and more fragmented, its heart still beating in the city, but its body stretching toward infinity. In 1851, the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park crowned this new industrial empire. The Crystal Palace, a vast hall of glass and iron, rose like a vision of the future. Inside, visitors wandered among machines' fabrics and inventions from across the globe. The smell of oil and varnish mingled with perfume. The hum of admiration filled the air. For 6 months, London imagined itself the center of human achievement, and perhaps it was. When Queen Victoria and Prince Albert toured the exhibition, the cheering crowd embodied a century's worth of pride and exhaustion. Yet beneath the grandeur, unrest simmered. The same workers who built the empire began to demand their share of it. Chartists marched for voting rights. Strikes erupted in factories and docks. The city's ruling elite responded with caution, fearing that revolution might follow, as it had in Paris. But London's revolutions came not in guillotines, but in law, slow, procedural, enduring. Bit by bit, reform reshaped the machinery of governance, just as engineers reshaped the city itself. The Thames, once the city's shame, became its lifeline again. Joseph Bazalgette's vast sewer system, begun after the Great Stink, transformed sanitation and saved lives. His underground cathedrals of brick carried away the filth that had poisoned generations. Above ground, the new embankment promenades gave the city space to breathe. For the first time in centuries, the river smelled of water, not death. By the century's midpoint, London had become a paradox, the largest, richest, dirtiest, most modern city in the world. It dazzled visitors and exhausted its own citizens. Gas lamps lit the night, but their glow revealed shadows as deep as ever, shadows of hunger, ambition, and restless change. By the middle of the 19th century, the city of London had swollen into a living labyrinth, its boundaries stretching its breadth, thick with coal smoke, its veins pulsing with the new rhythm of the machine. Railways screamed through tunnels beneath Georgian terraces, their engines throwing sparks that danced like fireflies in the smog. The streets above were jammed with omnibuses, hansom cabs, and the endless shuffle of human feet. It was the height of the industrial age, and London stood at the center of the world's experiment in modernity, a city both triumphant and exhausted, where invention touched everything except rest. Queen Victoria's long reign lent the age its name, but it was London that defined its character. Under her watch, the city became the beating heart of an empire that encircled the globe. Ships sailed from the Pool of London, carrying cotton, from India, sugar, from the Caribbean wool, from Australia, and tea from Ceylon. The world's goods passed through the city's docks, and its wealth through its banks. Yet behind the marble columns of the Royal Exchange and the grandeur of the West End lay tenements that barely saw daylight. Poverty pressed so tightly against splendor that they shared the same walls. Charles Dickens walked those narrow lanes at midnight, taking notes by lamplight. His novels captured the paradox of the city better than any statistic could a place of miracle and misery, progress and penance. When Bleak House described the fog that crept into the cabooses of collier brigs, readers knew it not as metaphor, but as reality. The same yellow haze that rolled daily through Fleet Street and over the river, blurring the edges of towers and time. The fog was London's unofficial emblem, its beauty and its poison intertwined. Still, progress was relentless. The railways that had once terrified Londoners soon became its skeleton. Terminals like King's Cross and Paddington transformed the city into a nexus of national movement. Within decades, the Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground line, opened in 1863, tunneling beneath the chaos. Its steam engines hissed through tiled corridors, ferrying passengers who marveled at the novelty of traveling without sky. The newspapers called it the serpent beneath the city, but Londoners embraced it all the same. Each innovation that seemed monstrous became in time indispensable. With industry came new kinds of architecture. The iron and glass pavilions of the Great Exhibition in 1851 had inspired a generation of engineers. Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace shimmered like a dream of the future, a cathedral made of transparency and ambition. After the exhibition, It was moved to Sydenham, where it stood like a monument to progress until flames devoured it, decades later, a fitting London fate. Meanwhile, new civic buildings rose across the capital, the Houses of Parliament, rebuilt in Gothic splendour, the new law courts, the museums of South Kensington. Empire had made London rich enough to marble its conscience. Yet progress did not mean peace. The working class, squeezed by industrial expansion and poor housing, began to organize. Chartist marches, dock worker strikes, and suffrage rallies filled the city's squares with shouts for justice. The police, now formally established as bobbies, tried to maintain order with calm discipline and new uniforms of blue. Even so, unrest simmered. Trafalgar Square became the city's political barometer, its pigeons and fountains witnessing each new wave of protest. London was discovering democracy the hard way through mud speeches and patience. Amid all this struggle, something tender persisted. Parks bloomed, Hyde Park, Regent's Park, Victoria Park, green lungs for a city choking on its own success. On Sundays, families strolled along the Serpentine Children, licking sticky sweets, nannies pushing prams beneath elms. Bands played waltzes, while balloons drifted skyward. For a few hours, even the poorest Londoner could breathe free air, though smoke still hovered on the horizon. It was a small mercy in a city that seldom stopped to rest. The city's infrastructure grew with astonishing ambition. Baselget's sewer network, begun after the Great Stink of 1858, turned engineering into salvation. Miles of brick tunnels carried away filth that had once poisoned the river. Above them, new embankments transformed the Thames into a place of promenades, gas lamps, and evening reflections. London's lungs and arteries were being rebuilt one pipe at a time. The city that had once buried its dead by the tens of thousands during cholera outbreaks was finally literally cleaning itself. Technology crept into daily life with quiet certainty. Telegraph wires hummed above the streets. Photography froze time in silver. And by the 1880s, electric light began to challenge the reign of gas. Shop windows gleamed brighter, theaters glowed longer, and the night, once the city's curtain, became another stage. The sound of progress was everywhere. The tick of clocks, the hiss of steam, the clang of factory bells calling workers to their shifts. The Victorian day was long, but never long enough for its appetite. Yet beneath the hum of industry, the human heart persisted. Music halls echoed with laughter. Penny dreadfuls terrified readers with stories of thieves and ghosts, and church choirs filled the smoggy air with hymns that seemed to promise redemption. Even crime became legend, Jack the Ripper's murders in Whitechapel turning fear into fascination. The newspapers sold terror by the thousands, and London, morbidly enthralled, devoured every word. The empire's reach extended so far that the city itself became a museum of the world. Artifacts from Egypt, India, and Polynesia filled the new British Museum. Scholars catalogued, classified, and claimed. In the docks, sailors from every continent mingled in taverns, their voices weaving a tapestry of languages that no map could contain. London was no longer simply English, it was planetary. By century's end, the skyline had changed again. Tower Bridge, opened in 1894, rose like a mechanical guardian over the Thames Part Castle part machine, its great arms lifting for passing ships. It symbolized London, perfectly medieval in dress, modern in spirit. On the opposite bank, St. Paul's still reigned its dome, now grey with soot but unwavering. The two structures faced each other like generations in conversation. The old and the new, both bound to the same river. Night in Victorian London was a study in contrasts. Gas lamps glowed over glittering theatres, while beyond their radius, the streets vanished into darkness. Gentlemen hailed hansom cabs after soirees in Mayfair, their laughter echoing against Whetstone, while across the river, silhouettes huddled under bridges for warmth. The city's wealth could illuminate the world, but could not quite reach its own shadows. When the 19th century gave way to the 20th, London stood immense and confident, its empire sprawling its skyline, a blend of domes, spires, and chimneys. The fog still lingered, curling through alleys and over bridges, but beneath it beat a city no longer medieval or Victorian, but unmistakably modern. Trams rattled through new boulevards, electric lights shimmered over shop fronts, and in the cafes of Bloomsbury and Soho, conversation turned to art science and the strange future unfolding before them. The world had entered the machine age, and London, for better or worse, was its capital. The reign of Edward VII ushered in a brief glittering period of self-assurance, the Edwardian era that lasts long exhale before the storm. The city was dressed for prosperity. Marble facades replaced soot-blackened brick-wide avenues, cut through old neighborhoods and theaters along Shaftesbury Avenue, and the Strand blazed with electric light. The motor car, still a novelty, hummed past horse-drawn cabs in a dance of eras overlapping. Music drifted from gramophones, mingling with the shouts of newspaper boys crying headlines about stock prices, suffragettes, and scandals, yet the elegance was a thin veneer. The slums of the East End remained overcrowded wages, stagnant, and disease persistent. Social reformers, like Charles Booth, mapped the city street by street, charting poverty in shades of despair. His Poverty Map of London, published in the 1890s and updated into the new century, revealed what everyone already knew, but few admitted, that within walking distance of Mayfair's luxury lay hunger and hopelessness. The empire's capital was both a palace and a prison, depending on which side of the river you called home. Still progress pressed on. The first underground electric lines opened, replacing steam with quiet hums of current. The new tube trains whisked passengers from Kensington to the city in minutes, shrinking geography into convenience. The postal service, once a horse-bound marvel, now moved through subterranean tunnels as well. London was learning to live beneath itself, a city above and below, connected by tunnels, cables, and pipes, all throbbing with the lifeblood of modernity. Above-ground voices rose for equality. The suffragette movement, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, filled Trafalgar Square and Parliament steps with chants for women's right to vote. Police lines clashed with protesters. Banners were torn, but the will of the movement hardened. Hunger strikes in Holloway Prison drew national attention. The city that once crowned kings was now birthing the modern idea of citizenship, messy, defiant, unstoppable. Technology raced ahead, and so did anxiety. Airships drifted over the city in demonstration flights, stirring both wonder and unease. Air, once the last unconquered space, had become another frontier. Newspapers spoke breathlessly of aviation automobiles and the telephone, while in drawing rooms, people debated whether progress itself was moving too quickly. The hum of engines replaced the ring of church bells as the new sound of London life. Then in 1914 the world cracked. The Great War arrived not with cannons in London streets, but with silence. posters, recruitment drives, and the slow realization that this industrial age had built machines not just for production, but for destruction. London became both fortress and factory. Men queued outside enlistment offices. Women filled the gaps. They left running trams, factories, and hospitals. Zeppelin raids turned the night sky into a source of terror. Searchlights stabbing upward, sirens wailing, and bombs falling through the fog. The city that had survived plague and fire now faced the age of mechanized death. Even so, life persisted between the sirens. Theaters stayed open to lift spirits. Music halls rang with songs of hope and gallows humor. Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag. They sang as if melody could muffle fear. The underground doubled as a shelter, families huddling on platforms as explosions echoed above. And when the armistice came in 1918, the jubilation was almost disbelieving. Crowds filled Trafalgar Square. Big Ben rang again. Strangers kissed in the streets. But beneath the cheers lay exhaustion. London had lost nearly a generation of its young. The empire still stood, but the illusions that held it together had cracked. The interwar years brought both innovation and uncertainty. The skyline shifted again, steel frames replacing stone Art Deco, rising where Gothic once ruled. Airplanes landed at Croydon, bringing the world closer. Broadcasting turned voices into ghosts that traveled through the air. In 1922, the BBC began transmitting from Savoy Hill, and Londoners gathered around radios to hear news music and the King's first Christmas message. The city had found a new form of community, one not bound by streets but by sound. Culturally, London blossomed. Writers like Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, and George Orwell found poetry in its contradictions. In smoky Bloomsbury rooms, intellectuals discussed modernism, psychoanalysis, and the boundaries of art. Meanwhile, in Soho's clubs, jazz bands from America transformed night into a blur of rhythm and possibility. Women cut their hair, hemlines rose, and the old order trembled beneath the beat of a new century, but shadows lengthened once more. The global crash of 1929 shattered prosperity, and unemployment spread through docklands and factories. By the 1930s, hunger marches set out from northern towns, converging on London in protest. The empire that once fed the world now could not feed its own. Political extremism imported from the continent found small but noisy audiences. In Cable Street, 1936, ordinary EastEnders Jews, dockworkers, communists, and housewives stood shoulder to shoulder to block a fascist march. Their victory that day became legend, the city's defiant refusal to tolerate tyranny, however loudly it shouted. When war came in September 1939, London met it not with shock, but with a grim, almost weary determination. The generation that had mourned sons in the trenches now watched their grandchildren don gas masks and join evacuation trains bound for the countryside. Posters declared, "Keep calm and carry on," and somehow people did. Sandbags appeared outside the National Gallery. The lions of Trafalgar Square were wrapped in wooden scaffolds. Statues vanished under protective casings as if the city were bracing its very soul. The river, ever watchful, flowed beneath darkened bridges. Street lamps were dimmed signs removed, and windows covered in blackout curtains. London had survived many assaults, but this time the enemy would come from the sky. The Blitz began on a warm September night in 1940. The air raid sirens wailed a sound that froze the city's heart before it taught it to beat again. Searchlights clawed the clouds, while the drone of bombers thickened the darkness. Then came the thunder bombs, falling in waves, fire consuming streets, glass shattering like ice. The docks burned first, then the East End, then the heart of the city. Flames leapt high enough to paint the sky crimson. People huddled in underground stations, clutching blankets, radios, and one another. By morning, whole neighborhoods had vanished, yet the spirit that emerged from that destruction became the stuff of legend. Londoners coined a kind of humor for survival, the Blitz spirit, equal parts defiance and exhaustion. Milkmen delivered bottles through smoking streets. Buses resumed their routes, even when the roads had craters. The BBC broadcast from basements. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited bombed-out districts, walking among the rubble to the cheers of soot-covered children. Even St. Paul's, hit by incendiaries, stood untouched amid the inferno, a silver dome floating above flames, immortalized in photographs that became symbols of resilience. The attacks lasted for months, then years, punctuated by lulls that felt almost peaceful until the sirens returned. The city became a rhythm of work, fear, and rebuilding. Each morning after a raid, volunteers cleared rubble, searched for survivors, and began again. Underground tunnels turned into communities, children played by candlelight families, shared tea, and musicians performed to lift morale. A generation learned to sleep through bombs, to find calm in catastrophe. And yet beneath the stoicism, grief accumulated like dust. Every street bore its wounds, houses sliced in half-lives, rearranged overnight. The smell of smoke and damp brick became the scent of endurance. Letters from the front mingled with casualty lists from home. When the V-1 flying bombs began falling in 1944, their engine droned sudden silence, then explosion tested even the most stoic hearts. The city held on, counting each night as victory. When peace finally came in May 1945, London erupted. Crowds flooded Piccadilly, Trafalgar Square, and Westminster Bridge, singing, laughing, weeping. Bonfires burned once more, this time in celebration. The war had scarred the city deeply. 30,000 civilians dead, entire boroughs reduced to rubble, the docks in ruins. But it had not broken London's identity. If anything, the Blitz had burned into its DNA the certainty that survival was its calling. The post-war years were another kind of struggle. The empire that had sustained London's power was crumbling. The city turned inward, weary but resolute. Rationing lingered long after victory, and the bomb sites remained as playgrounds for children who didn't remember the war, but grew up among its ruins. Yet amid austerity, hope took root. The Labour government's welfare reforms, free healthcare through the National Health Service, new housing projects, and public education promised a fairer future. London became not just a capital of resilience, but of reinvention. Architects envisioned a new kind of city rising from the rubble. Prefabricated homes dotted the suburbs. Concrete towers promised efficiency, if not beauty. The Festival of Britain in 1951 embodied that optimism, a showcase of design art and modernity on the South Bank. The Skyline Tower rose like a silver spear, pointing toward a future that felt suddenly possible. Across the river, St. Paul still watched, serene and unchanged, the eternal witness to each rebirth. The 1950s brought color back to London's grey palette. Trams gave way to red double-decker buses. Ration books disappeared. Cinemas filled again. American jazz and rock and roll echoed from basement clubs in Soho, where smoke curled through the air, and youth began to rebel against their parents' weariness. Immigrants from across the Commonwealth arrived, Caribbean, Indian, African, answering Britain's call for workers to rebuild its shattered industries. They brought with them food, music, and warmth that would transform London's culture forever. The empire had dissolved, but its people had come home to the heart of it. This new diversity met resistance and renewal in equal measure. The old city sometimes recoiled, unsure of its own reflection, but gradually it changed. Brixton, Notting Hill, and Hackney filled with new voices and rhythms. The sound of London streets shifted reggae, mixing with Cockney slang curries, alongside fish and chips, saris beside suits. Out of this fusion came a city no longer imperial, but global in truth. Even the skyline began to adapt. Cranes dotted the horizon, glass rose beside stone. London's scars turned to foundations. The bombed ruins of the East End became new estates. The docks slowly transformed into industrial parks. The river, once black and foul, began to breathe again. Commerce returned slower but steadier, as the city rediscovered its old genius for adaptation. In 1953, coronation bells rang for a new queen. Elizabeth II rode through the rain-soaked streets, her procession watched by millions in person and newly for the first time on television. The broadcast united the nation in real time, turning London's pageantry into shared memory. Cameras captured not just the splendor of Westminster Abbey, but the faces of ordinary Londoners lining the rude faces, tired yet luminous with pride. The city had seen kings and conquerors come and go, but it had never before seen itself reflected back through a lens. The 1960s arrived in London not quietly, but like a shout across the world. After 2 decades of ration books and rubble, the city rediscovered its color. For the first time in living memory, London felt young. Music spilled from basement clubs in Soho. Laughter echoed through Carnaby Street, and the grey post-war streets began to bloom with neon and rebellion. The generation born during or just after the Blitz had come of age, determined to leave behind the weariness of their parents' world. In a city once defined by endurance, joy became its new defiance. The transformation began in sound. The Beatles, though, from Liverpool, found their stage in London recording at Abbey Road and performing in theatres where the walls shook with screams. The Rolling Stones prowled the clubs of Richmond and Chelsea, while Dusty Springfield and the Kinks gave the city its voice in harmony and grit. Swinging London was not a slogan, it was a state of mind. On a Saturday night in Soho or the King's Road, one could feel history loosening its tie. The city of empire and austerity was learning to dance. Fashion led the revolution. Mary Quant's miniskirts strutted through the streets like declarations of independence. Models like Twiggy turned the sidewalks into catwalks. The tailoring of Savile Row collided with the wild patterns of youth culture. Even the old cards of tradition royalty parliament, the city could not entirely resist the tide of modernity sweeping their doorsteps. London had become almost accidentally the capital of cool. For the first time in centuries, it set global trends not by decree but by creativity, yet beneath the glamour, old ghosts lingered. The city's working-class neighborhoods still struggled with poverty and poor housing. Notting Hill, long neglected, became a crucible of both hardship and hope. Caribbean immigrants, who had arrived a decade earlier on ships like the Empire Windrush, faced discrimination and exclusion, yet they brought with them music color and resilience. Out of those tensions rose the Notting Hill Carnival, first held in 1966, a defiant celebration of culture, rhythm, and belonging. The drums and steel bands echoed through streets that had once burned with race riots, transforming conflict into connection. Technology and art fed the same fever. The BBC began broadcasting in colour. Cinemas premiered James Bond and kitchen sink dramas alike. The London Underground expanded with bold new designs, bright tiles, Helvetica fonts, clean modernist signage. Harold Wilson's government spoke of the white heat of technology, and for once the rhetoric matched the mood. Computer satellites and skyscrapers promised a future that shimmered just out of reach. The skyline long defined by St. Paul's and the Houses of Parliament began to sprout cranes and glass. But it wasn't all optimism. The Cold War loomed, and nuclear dread threaded its way into daily life. The government built shelters, the BBC rehearsed wartime scripts. Protesters gathered in Trafalgar Square under the banner of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, marching from Aldermaston to London with the peace symbol and emblem that would outlive the age itself. Even in an era of miniskirts and rock and roll, the old fear of annihilation persisted, whispering beneath the music. The 1970s brought the hangover after the high. London entered a decade of strikes, inflation, and social friction. Power cuts plunged streets into darkness. Rubbish piled in alleys. The Thames grew thick and lifeless again. But the city, ever resourceful, turned disillusion into art. Punk exploded from its gutters, the Sex Pistols snarling from stages in Hammersmith, the Clash railing against the system. Safety pins replaced pearls. Defiance replaced decorum. The establishment, baffled, called it chaos. But for London's youth, it was honesty, a reminder that creativity had always been born from the cracks. New communities continued to reshape the city. South Asian and African immigrants transformed neighborhoods like Brick Lane, Southall, and Brixton, with markets, mosques, and temples. The scent of curry plantain and incense mingled with diesel fumes and rain, creating a sensory symphony that belonged nowhere but London. The capital was becoming something new, not English in the old sense, but metropolitan in the modern one. Multiculturalism was not yet a word of pride, but it was a reality already blooming in the streets. Meanwhile, modern architecture asserted its presence. The brutalist towers of the Barbican rose from post-war rubble, raw concrete monuments, to a utopia that never quite arrived. Motorways cut through historic neighborhoods. Office blocks replaced Victorian terraces. The city grew denser, louder, taller. To some, this was progress. To others, vandalism. Londoners accustomed to surviving change crumbled, but adapted as always. By the 1980s, the city was changing again, this time in finance rather than fashion. The docks of the East End, long silent, were reborn as Canary Wharf, a forest of glass towers reaching toward the clouds. The old industries of shipbuilding and textiles faded, replaced by stockbrokers and bankers. Margaret Thatcher's government deregulated the markets, and the Big Bang of 1986 turned the city into a global engine of capital once more. Money replaced manufacturing. Ambition replaced nostalgia. The skyline glittered with new lights, but the gap between rich and poor yawned wider than ever. Even so, art and rebellion remained the city's pulse. Brixton's reggae, Camden's rock Soho's avant-garde theatre all thrived in the cracks between power and poverty. The AIDS crisis struck hard, taking lives and revealing again London's capacity for both cruelty and compassion. Activists, doctors, and artists rallied in defiance, transforming grief into action. The city's creativity had always been entwined with its pain. By the end of the century, the fog of coal smoke was gone, replaced by the glow of sodium lamps and neon signs. The Thames Barrier, completed in 1982, guarded the city from floods. The Docklands Light Railway hummed over once abandoned wharves. London had survived war decay and reinvention yet again. Its river, once an artery of empire, now reflected a different kind of power, the quiet gleam of commerce culture and coexistence. When the new millennium dawned, London stood beneath fireworks, reflected in the Thames, its skyline glittering like a crown of glass. The city that had survived plague fire, war and industrial fog, now greeted the 21st century with a smile perhaps weary, perhaps wary, but undeniably alive. The old clock at Westminster struck midnight over a crowd of millions, and for a brief moment, history seemed to hold its breath. Cameras flashed from every angle, television screens carried the spectacle to every continent, and the world saw what London had always known. It was not just a city, but a story still being written. In those first years of the 2000s, optimism shimmered like the morning mist over the river. The new Millennium Dome rose on the Greenwich Peninsula, a vast white tent, half cathedral, half curiosity, built to celebrate human progress and possibility. The London Eye, a giant wheel of steel and glass on the south bank, began to turn offering views once reserved for angels and architects. Tourists lined the embankment, their faces lit by phones that would soon define the age. The city had always loved spectacle, but now it glowed with a confidence born not of empire, but of diversity. The capital of one nation had quietly become the crossroads of many. By the early 2000s, more than 250 languages were spoken within its borders. Street markets in Camden Brick Lane and Brixton buzzed with food from every corner of the world. Jerk chicken beside samosas, Turkish coffee beside Cornish pasties. Mosques, temples, synagogues and cathedrals shared the same skyline. London's past, as an empire of conquest, had been remade into an empire of conversation. The very air seemed polyphonic accents, blending into a melody that belonged nowhere else on earth. The city's economy boomed with equal energy. Banks and global firms clustered in Canary Wharf, and the city, their mirrored towers catching the sun. The Thames, once an artery of ships and soot, now reflected shimmering blue light and silver glass. Construction cranes swung like metronomes over Docklands and South Bank, where museums, concert halls, and cafes turned derelict warehouses into playgrounds of art and culture. The Tate Modern opened in 2000 inside the old Bankside Power Station, a cathedral of contemporary art housed within a monument to industry. It was London in miniature, the past repurposed humming with the future. Yet prosperity cast long shadows. The price of living rose faster than wages. Property speculation hollowed out old neighborhoods. Artists who had once transformed Shoreditch were pushed farther east. Market stalls gave way to boutiques. The skyline grew richer but colder, a reflection of global capital as much as local life. Still, the city adapted as it always had. Londoners, practical and proud, learned to navigate the paradox of success and inequality, with humor, resilience, and the quiet comfort of complaint. A civic pastime as old as the Tower itself. Then on a bright morning, in July 2005, the rhythm shattered. 4 bombs exploded across the city's transport network. 3 on the underground, 1 on a bus at Tavistock Square. 52 lives lost in minutes. Smoke-filled tunnels, sirens wailed across the city that had learned to endure every kind of flame. In the chaos that followed, strangers carried one another to safety, shared water, shared silence. Within hours, Handwritten notes and flowers appeared in the stations, the pavements heavy with grief. The next morning, the tube reopened. London's unspoken motto, "Carry On," had found its truest expression. That same decade brought celebration too. In 2012, the city hosted the Olympic Games, transforming once neglected East London into a landscape of stadiums, parks, and light. The world watched again as the Thames sparkled under fireworks, and athletes marched beneath the same sky that had once glowed red with fire in 1666. The Olympic torch passed through streets older than nations, carried by hands of every color, every faith. For 17 days, London felt united in a way few could remember. It was not a celebration of power, but of people ordinary and extraordinary, side by side. Technology changed daily life in subtler ways. The hum of conversation on buses gave way to the soft glow of phone screens. Maps folded into apps. Money vanished into cards and clicks. The city's pulse moved faster, more digital, less predictable. Delivery bikes replaced milk carts. The sound of footsteps merged with the buzz of electric cars. Even the air began to change again, no longer black with soot, but heavy with data. Wi-Fi signals and drone flights above the river. Yet beneath the new, the old London endured. Big Ben still tolled over Westminster. The bells of St. Paul's still marked the hours. In quiet corners of Hampstead Heath or along the grey stones of Fleet Street, one could still hear echoes of every century layered beneath the present one. A Londoner might check a phone at the bus stop where a Roman road once ran, or sip coffee above the buried ruins of a medieval hall. The city's time was not linear, but concentric, each age circling within the next. The 21st century also tested London's sense of unity. The financial crash of 2008 shook the towers of Canary Wharf. Jobs vanished, and austerity tightened budgets across boroughs. In 2017, tragedy struck again when fire consumed the Grenfell Tower, killing 72 people and exposing the city's deepest inequality in the starkest light. The sight of that tower burning against the night felt like an echo of the Great Fire centuries earlier, another reminder that progress without care could betray its own people. From that grief came anger, solidarity, and a renewed demand for justice. Politically, London often found itself at odds with the rest of the country. In 2016, when Britain voted to leave the European Union, the capital voted overwhelmingly to remain. It was a reminder of what London had become: global, intertwined, forward-looking. The Brexit years brought division, debate, and fatigue, but through it all, the city kept moving buses, running cranes, lifting music, playing in basement bars. London rarely paused for politics. It endured them. As the decade closed, the skyline reached higher than ever. The Shard pierced the clouds, a spire of glass, rivaling St. Paul's for dominance. To the east, the Thames barrier gleamed like steel petals, guarding the city from rising seas. To the west, Heathrow roared with the sound of a world still arriving. London's history had always been written in opposites: fire and water plague, and rebirth, empire and equality. And in the 21st century, that pattern continued. Then came the pandemic. In 2020, silence fell again. Streets emptied, theaters closed, and the city that had survived everything found itself eerily still. The underground hummed half-empty. Pigeons ruled Trafalgar Square. But from balconies and doorways came applause for nurses, couriers, and cleaners. Windows glowed with hand-painted rainbows. Once more, London learned that endurance need not be loud. By the 2020s, London had once again proven itself incapable of standing still. Out of the quiet of the pandemic, years rose a new rhythm, tentative, fragile, yet filled with an old familiar stubbornness. The city that had learned to rebuild from ashes now learned to reconnect after silence. Cafes reopened like flowers in spring, buses filled with masked commuters and muted chatter. Theatre lights flickered back to life, revealing both nostalgia and relief. London was bruised but breathing. In its streets lingered an unspoken understanding that this too was only another chapter in its endless apprenticeship with survival. The skyline has ever changed faster than memory could keep up. Glass towers multiplied along the Thames, their reflections turning the river into a corridor of light. Old warehouses at Battersea became luxury apartments. Former factories in Hackney transformed into galleries, startups, and lofts. The past was not erased, merely repainted its ghosts, still whispering beneath polished floors. Construction cranes stood where church spires once dominated the new steeples of commerce and ambition. Yet amid all that glitter, small miracles persisted: the ring of bicycle bells on cobblestones, the smell of rain on the south bank, a busker singing beneath Waterloo Bridge. These details, fleeting human ordinary, were what kept London real. Technology, once a background hum, now defined its pulse. Commuters no longer carried maps or cash. Tickets were invisible transactions, contactless. Algorithms predicted train delays. Drones inspected rooftops. Taxis drove themselves down roads that had once known horse-drawn carriages. But for all the change, the ancient logic of the city remained: the morning rush, the evening slowdown, the odd sense that every Londoner, from banker to baker, moved in some invisible rhythm set long ago by the tide of the Thames. Beneath the digital facade, the same old heartbeat persisted. The air buzzed with new contradictions. London called itself global and green, yet its skyline glowed with energy-hungry towers. Borough councils fought to balance history with housing progress with peace. Streets, once lined with pubs and corner shops, became rows of minimalist cafes and sleek co-working spaces. Rents soared, artists drifted outward. The city's creative soul found cheaper refuge in Peckham warehouses, Croydon studios, and online spaces that ignored geography altogether. But if art moved, so did its audience. London's imagination was too restless to vanish, only to migrate. Still, for all its complexities, the city carried a strange serenity at dusk. The lights along the embankment shimmered against the dark river. St. Paul's glowed softly, patient as ever. And across the skyline, cranes froze mid-motion, as if pausing to listen to the hum below. The sound of evening London was no longer the clatter of iron wheels or the creak of wooden ships, but a layered murmur: sirens, traffic, conversation, music. It was the same noise that had echoed here for 2,000 years, only set to a new tempo. Socially, the 2020s deepened London's contradictions. It remained one of the wealthiest cities on earth, yet food banks multiplied. Global finance thrived in glass towers, while homelessness persisted in their shadows. Migration continued to shape the city's soul. Syrians, Ukrainians, Afghans, Africans, each brought languages and traditions that wove themselves into London's endless tapestry. Street markets became small parliaments of the world where accents collided more freely than politicians ever could. For all its inequities, London's identity remained plural, resilient, untidy, and alive. Climate change added new anxiety to the city's long list of trials. Summers grew hotter, the Thames periodically threatened to breach its banks, and the air carried a faint metallic tang of pollution, despite endless campaigns for cleaner skies. Yet even that challenge stirred innovation. Electric buses glided silently through Oxford Street. Green roofs and vertical gardens softened the hard geometry of glass. Londoners, pragmatic, as always, adapted with umbrellas for rain and sunscreen for heat waves. A people both cynical and hopeful in the same breath. The royal city evolved too. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022 marked the end of an era that had spanned nearly 70 years of London's transformations. Crowds once again filled the Mall, this time in mourning. The city seemed to pause as her coffin passed beneath grey skies, the bells of Westminster Abbey tolling through drizzle. It was a moment heavy with history, the last echo of the post-war Britain she had symbolized. Days later, life resumed as it always did. London mourned, remembered, and then moved forward. The reign of Charles III began quieter, but not without reflection, a bridge between tradition and the restless uncertainty of the modern world. Through all this, the city's spirit refused to fade. Londoners gathered where they always had in parks, pubs, and protest marches. Climate rallies surged through Westminster. Vigils filled Trafalgar Square. Marathon runners pounded along the embankment to cheers. Musicians performed on rooftops. Lovers met beneath station clocks. Even amid digital isolation, real connection endured. The city's population passed 9 million each person, their own small history folded into the greater one. Night fell differently now. The glow of screens replaced some of the street lamp warmth, yet there was beauty in it still. From Primrose Hill or Greenwich Park, one could look down and see the city stretch endlessly, a galaxy of human light. Somewhere within that glitter, the ancient Roman wall still slept beneath office floors. The plague pits rested beneath playgrounds. The ghosts of Shakespeare's players still haunted Bankside. London's story had never been linear. It was sedimentary, each layer visible if one knew how to listen. What defined it now was neither empire nor industry, but coexistence. The city had become a living archive of humanity, past and present, stacked like bricks in a wall. Every new tower rose beside something old. Every old church stood between something new. Its people changed languages, fashions, and ideals, but the rhythm, the subtle, tireless hum of continuity, never faltered. London in the mid-2020s was a paradox, both dazzling and weary, ancient and unborn. It glittered with the light of its skyscrapers and the glow of a million phone screens. Yet beneath that brightness was an undertone of fatigue, as if a city that had carried 2 millennia of history was pausing, taking a long breath before its next reinvention. The streets were as alive as ever, markets bustling, buses, humming voices, colliding in 50 accents on a single corner. But the pace had quickened to the point where even the river seemed to rush. The Thames, that patient witness to every rise and ruin, moved faster now, as if mimicking the flow of data, money, and migration that defined its city. The skyline, once dominated by domes and spires, now resembled a digital forest. The Shard glimmered like a shard of ice. The Gherkin curved like a steel seashell, and new towers, more reflective than real, stretched upward each year. From a distance, the city looked untouchable, an empire of class. Up close, however, the truth remained as messy as ever. Rent crises, food insecurity, overstretched hospitals, and protests that filled Westminster Bridge with banners and chants. London's genius had always been to hold opposites together, to balance grandeur with grit. In this new century, that balance had become a daily negotiation. For all its ambition, the city still listened to its old voices. The bells of St. Mary le Bow, centuries older than the language most Londoners spoke, still marked the hour. Street preachers still called for repentance on Oxford Street, their words drowned by traffic and laughter. On Sunday mornings, joggers shared Hyde Park with elderly couples feeding ducks. On Friday nights, Shoreditch pulsed with electronic music spilling from bars. The contrast was the point. London was not harmony. It was polyphony beautiful, because it refused to resolve. Digital life rewired its rhythm. Cash faded, queues shortened. Time itself seemed to compress. A Londoner could order food, hail a car, and attend a meeting without leaving bed. But this convenience came with a quiet loneliness. Where once people had shouted across market stalls, now they texted silently across boroughs. Still small gestures of humanity endured the bus driver's nod, the stranger holding open a door, the impromptu applause when someone played a piano left on a station concourse. The city had always survived by remembering that civilization begins with kindness. Amid the noise of traffic and technology, the natural world pressed faintly but persistently against the edges. Parakeets screamed in the plane trees of Battersea Park. Foxes slinked through moonlit gardens of Hampstead. Bees buzzed in rooftop hives above the city. Urban planners spoke of rewilding London, but nature, irreverent as ever, had been doing it on its own. Even the Thames, once so toxic, it was declared biologically dead, now shimmered with seals and salmon again. The oldest Londoner of all the river itself was quietly healing. Politically, the city stood apart, both powerful and precarious. Its economy rivaled nations, yet its politics were often at odds with them. Londoners voted one way, the rest of the country another. National debates over housing, transport, and identity played out in its boroughs like small civil wars. But while leaders changed and slogans faded, the pulse of local life continued. A street market, a school concert, a football match in the drizzle, these were the rituals that mattered more than manifestos. The city, older than any government, knew how to outweight every ideology. Culturally, the new century belonged to London's storytellers. Filmmakers turned its reign into cinematic poetry. Musicians remixed its chaos into beats that traveled the globe. The spoken word poets of Brixton, the visual artists of Hackney, Wick the coders of King's Cross, all were heirs to the same creative restlessness that had once built theatres on the South Bank and printing presses in Fleet Street. The medium had changed, but the message remained the city dreams best in noise. And yet, for all its dynamism, London was haunted by questions of belonging. Who, in the end, could afford to live here? Who claimed the skyline, the pavements, the view from the bridge at sunset? The city had always belonged to everyone, and to no one, to Romans and refugees, traders and tourists, kings and cleaners. But in an age when property had become a commodity, and neighborhoods changed faster than friendships, many Londoners felt like tenants of time itself. They loved the city fiercely, but feared they might one day be priced out of its memory. Still, the magic persisted. On winter evenings, fog rolled over the Thames, softening the sharp lines of glass until the skyline looked almost medieval again. The domes and towers blurred into suggestion. The lights along the bridges shimmered like constellations, and the city seemed for a heartbeat, timeless. One could stand on Westminster Bridge and hear the same water that had carried Roman barges and Viking ships, Tudor galleons, and industrial steamers. London had changed its clothes, but never its soul. The late-night Londoner nurse, finishing a shift poet, chasing an idea cleaner, unlocking an office tower, was still part of a lineage stretching back to candlelit watchmen and medieval monks. The hum of buses replaced the clip of hooves, but the rhythm was unchanged. The city never truly slept. It merely closed one eye and dreamed. When morning breaks over London, the city does not awaken. It merely changes gear. The glow of night recedes, replaced by the pale light that slides across glass towers and terracotta chimneys, revealing a metropolis already in motion. Delivery vans glide through near-empty streets. Cyclists weave between buses, and the first train of the day rumbles beneath the pavement, echoing faintly through the tunnels that mirror the city's restless veins. The skyline glitters as if rinsed clean, but London's beauty at dawn is less in its sparkle than in its persistence. It has survived another night, as it always has, unbroken and unsentimental. Post-pandemic London carries a quiet caution. It remembers the empty streets, the boarded shop fronts, the eerie silence where life had once been constant. Now, as office workers return, with coffee cups and commuters fill the tube again, there is gratitude hidden behind fatigue. Small gestures, a nod at a bus driver, laughter in a lift, a child's chatter in the queue for school feel newly sacred. For all its ambition and noise, London's real renewal has always begun in such ordinary grace. Yet the city faces challenges that no monarch or plague could have imagined. The cost of living has turned survival into strategy. Rent rises like the tide. Groceries nibble at wages. The promise of prosperity, once the city's magnet, feels brittle. The skyline speaks in contradictions. Penthouses overlooking food banks, empty luxury flats beside overcrowded hostels. London's paradox has never been clearer. It is a place of abundance where scarcity walks easily through the crowd. And yet somehow, that crowd still holds together, held by the same unspoken faith that has sustained the city through every age, the belief that tomorrow might be better. In this century, community has taken new shapes. Where parish and market once anchored lives, now it is the invisible networks, online chats, shared rides, community kitchens that weave people together. London has always reinvented the meaning of belonging. A mosque in Whitechapel may double as a food bank. A library in Brixton hosts coding classes beside poetry readings. Old warehouses in Tottenham pulse with late-night music from 5 continents. The spirit of London has never been about conformity. It thrives in coexistence. The river remains its oldest confidant. At sunrise, joggers trace its banks. By evening, couples linger on its bridges. By night, lights shimmer across its surface like uncollected thoughts. Barges still move with unhurried rhythm, though the cargo now is tourists and conversation rather than coal and grain. Each reflection on the Thames is a small eternity. The dome of St. Paul's, the span of Tower Bridge, the glass shard piercing the clouds. Everything changes but the water's voice, which whispers of both beginnings and returns. Art continues to shape the city's self-image. In East London, murals bloom across brick walls. In galleries, installations flicker with questions about history, power, and place. The National Theatre hums with stories of modern life. The West End dazzles tourists with musicals that feel as timeless as the city's skyline. Meanwhile, on the peripheries, new artists reinvent old spaces. Disused car parks become exhibition halls. Railway arches turn into clubs. Small cinemas project films onto bare walls. The city's genius has always been improvisation, turning scarcity into stagecraft. Even its sounds evolve. The church bell, the traffic hum, the multilingual chatter. These blend now with electronic beats, street performances, and the crisp announcement of a train pulling into the platform. The London accent itself is changing, blending Caribbean rhythm, South Asian melody, and African cadence into something entirely new, the London multicultural English of the next generation. Language, like the city, refuses to stay still. But perhaps the most visible transformation lies in how London sees itself. The capital of empire is now a capital of empathy, though imperfectly. Statues are reconsidered, histories re-examined. The city's museums wrestle with what to return and what to remember. Monuments once silent are reinterpreted through the voices of those they once excluded. This reckoning does not erase pride. It complicates it, enriches it, gives it texture. London's identity has never been about purity, but about conversation. Every age has left its handwriting on the walls, and now those walls are learning to speak in chorus. Environmentally, the city leans toward green rooftop gardens, sprouting where smog once lingered, cycle lanes replacing congestion tree planting projects, threading through boroughs once choked by exhaust. Yet the future is uncertain. The Thames Barrier stands vigilant against rising seas, but climate predictions whisper of challenges yet to come. Londoners, pragmatic descendants of survivors, prepare quietly without panic. They have seen worse skies. The monarchy, now ceremonial, continues to punctuate time. Coronations, jubilees, funerals, each draws the world's gaze back to these streets. But for most Londoners, the city's real majesty lies elsewhere, the baker up before dawn in Peckham, the nurse walking home from St. Thomas's as the sun rises over the river, the busker playing yesterday on a cracked guitar beneath Charing Cross. Sovereignty has long since passed to the people who make the city move quietly and daily. And so as dusk returns, the lights rise again, millions of small affirmations flickering against the deepening blue. The city looks both eternal and ephemeral, its glass towers glowing like paper lanterns against the night. From the bridges, one can see the layers of history stacked like sediment, Roman walls, Tudor arches, Victorian sewers, digital skylines. London is not one city, but hundreds built atop one another, whispering through time. When the clock strikes midnight, its sound no longer belongs to any single age. It is a sound that has outlasted fires, bombs, kings, pandemics, and ideologies. It rings for everyone, old and new, rich and poor, local and migrant. Its tone carries through the fog, through the traffic, through the centuries, declaring the same truth. It always has, that life goes on, that cities endure, and that London, unruly, imperfect, unbreakable, still stands, still, breathes, still waits for tomorrow. So as you drift toward rest, let the city fade softly in your mind. Imagine the murmur of distant trains, the low hum of river water, and the bell that tolls across time. This is London, forever changing, forever, the same gently rocking the world to sleep.